we are stuck in a short-termism, only looking for short-term interest and short-term return. Typically, the financial sector is very much driven by the short-term interest rates and returns. This is, I'm not blaming it, but it isn't their job. So climate change is an issue of a long-term equilibrium. It's not about short-term equilibrium. But financing sector is mainly about short-term equilibrium. So how can we bridge this gap, the time gap? I think it's the role of the public sector. I don't think it can be overcome by only the private sector alone. So on this note, the main one important point I'd like to emphasize last is that why should we do that? It's not because only to save the world or save the climate change. But I'm always arguing that we should do that because it will deliver us even higher economic growth in the long run. If we choose to have a brown or high carbon trajectory, in the long run, our economic growth will be even lower. But if we choose to have a low carbon, green economic trajectory, then in the long run, we will have even higher economic growth rate in the long run. But unfortunately, the state of the knowledge of economics we have now cannot prove it. Nobody can prove that we can have a higher economic growth rate in the long run. I'm glad that we have an expert from OECD. And OECD, I learned a lot of double dividend. Double dividend meaning that if we have on Social Security. And they were experimenting it, whether there's a real double dividend. And I was in the OECD meeting room where a German delegate was making a presentation about the results after 5 years. They say the result was very positive. They created more jobs by doing this tax-based reform. So the reason is that why should we try to go over to a long-term future is because, in the end, it's not just a matter of saving climate change, but it's a matter of achieving even higher economic growth rate. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chung, for the illuminating remarks and especially stressing the point about the growth potential of the green economy and some of the bridges to achieving that, tax policy. Thank you for your remarks. Now I'd like to call upon our tireless project leader, Jan Willem van der Ven from the EBRD. He's the head of carbon markets to give some preparatory remarks. Jan Willem.
Thank you, Catullus, and good morning to all. I will keep it short because we have a number of very interesting presentations, and I hope also, as a consequence, an interesting discussion. Because today this is a workshop. It's about discussion. It's about trying to find, let's say, ways to improve the green finance situation. So I'm in the energy efficiency and climate change of the EBRD. We have, let's say, been advocating the issue of green finance already since the G8 in Glen Eagles. In 2015, we started with our green economic transition, our GET approach, which means that the EBRD has a 40% green finance target by 2020. We're making good ways to meeting that target, but yeah, we need to do more. And one of the key things is MDBs like the EBRD, we can't do this alone. We need to involve more the private sector finance in this issue. And we were therefore very pleased with AIFC when they came to us and asked, can you support us on considering the establishment of a green financial system. And because we saw that there are huge opportunities in Kazakhstan and also in the Central Asian region, investment opportunities, market opportunities in energy efficiency, renewable energy, or even avoided gas flaring. So there's a lot of investment potential, a lot of potential that also makes sense from a cost efficiency point of view. Yeah, these are commercially attractive investments, but still nothing is happening. And one of the reasons and factors in this development is there's a lack, or let's say, insufficient interest from the financial sector in these countries, in the region. And this is what, together with IIFC and the Green Financial System, we hope to remedy over time. It will be hill up, not hill down. Yeah. Therefore, I think, so today there will be interesting discussions around green bonds, around carbon market, and I hope that we find an interesting way to further indulge this growing market, this growing green market, to the, for the financial sector in the countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jan Willem. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Katelis Helmer, and I'm the team leader for this Green Financial System for Kazakhstan project. I'm with a company called Anavid, a strategic advisory firm. I've spent a number of years here in Kazakhstan advising the former Prime Minister, Mr. Masimov. So what I'm going to do now is just tell you a little bit about the project and situate it in its proper context, and then I will hand over to my colleagues to go into the respective detail. Can we bring up the project other presentation, please? That's it. So, Kazakhstan is in many ways a remarkable success story. Since independence, the country has achieved great strides. Growth has averaged more than 6% a year for 2 decades. Living standards, as measured by GDP per capita, have risen more than 8-fold in a single generation, and the nation has achieved upper middle income status. Unemployment has halved over the same period, and it's now lower than the Western developed economies of Europe and the United States. The blessing of high commodity prices, however, was also seized upon to build large financial buffers, with financial assets now totaling around 40% of GDP, or around $93 billion. Kazakhstan, in other words, has embraced transformation. However, the growth model that has been responsible and delivered success to a great extent now is on the rocks, challenged by a lower outlook for revenues from oil and other commodities. We have seen very clearly the vulnerabilities of a reliance on commodities in Kazakhstan and in many other countries over the last 18 months. At the same time, the threat posed by climate change is challenging Kazakhstan's highly energy-intensive and emissions-intensive economy. As the world's largest landlocked country, Kazakhstan is already experiencing consequences from climate change, including drought, desertification, and agricultural degradation. Charting a course for long-term prosperity therefore requires encouraging, as Mr. Chung mentioned, new drivers of greener growth. To remain on a path of success, to achieve a second transformation, Kazakhstan needs to embark upon a pathway towards a low-carbon future. This, of course, encompasses a series of important policy challenges. How to diversify away from oil and minerals, how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and energy intensity, and how to nurture new drivers of green growth whilst strengthening institutions and policy frameworks. This is the context for our project, and it's very much aligned with the existing national strategic plans, Kazakhstan Strategy 2050, the 100 concrete steps, and the concept for transition to a green economy. So a brief digression on terminology. What is green finance? It's talked about a lot, but it's rarely defined. So for the purposes of today, we are defining green finance into two components. It's first the financing of public and private green investments, or green financial flows. Second, it's the efforts to incorporate environmental considerations into business processes and decision making, whether that's risk assessments, whether that's strategy. Greening the financial system, in other words. Broadly speaking, green finance involves the effective management of environmental considerations and risks across the financial system. Our project then seeks to frame and assess and initiate development of a green financial system here in Kazakhstan. The building blocks are a robust analytical model and scenario planning, and we're of course placing specific emphasis on leveraging private sources of finance. So what are we doing? First, we're assessing the landscape. We're judging the progress that has been made, what are the local conditions, and we're identifying gaps and barriers. Then we're making a series of recommendations covering green standards, the introduction of green financial instruments, and the development of a carbon market. We have a multidisciplinary team at our disposal with expertise in policy and international law, in financial markets, as well as rules and regulations. And this same blend of experience is reflected in our diverse advisory group, which is chaired by Governor Kelembetov of the Astana International Financial Center and Agris Primanas from the EBRD, Kazakhstan's country director for EBRD. We also have Simon Zadek, co-director of the UN Environment's inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system, Mr. Ma Jun, the chief economist at China's central bank, and Dirk Forrester, the president and CEO of AITA, which is the key business association, for those who don't know, for carbon markets. The project is organized into 3 phases: an inception phase to assess the landscape and review international comparators and best practices, an analytical phase where we're preparing a roadmap and model for the green financial system, which covers a detailed review of domestic policies and capacities, and a long-term demand assessment for investments and services, as well as a series of recommendations for enabling investments. And then finally, a third dissemination phase where we will share the results of our work with the government and other relevant stakeholders. And so we're embarking on a series of consultations like this one today. We had a workshop about a month ago in Astana. We had our first advisory group meeting in Germany also last month. And the project culminates with a final seminar at the closing of Astana Expo in September. And of course, we hope you'll be able to join us for that. So what we're essentially attempting to do here with our project, it reminds me of a saying where there's no point going to bed early to save on candles if you wake up with twins. So what we're attempting to do is to avoid unnecessary inefficiencies and costs. We're helping Kazakhstan chart a pathway to avoid ending up with twins. So now I'd like to call upon Simon Buckle to provide some thoughts on the international context for green finance and the pathways to Paris. I just mentioned that the OECD is obviously a very important partner for Kazakhstan and has done a great deal of work in this area. So Simon, thank you.
So thank you very much, Katolis, and thank you for inviting me here today, and welcome to you all. Yes, the slide's up. What I wanted to talk about was actually quite broad, so I'll maybe skip over some of these slides quite quickly, and then we can come back to them in discussion if there's interest. But in terms of the outline, I just wanted to give you a bit of history on the Paris Agreement. That may be no news to anybody here, or it might be useful for some people So I'll skip over it fairly quickly, but ask questions later if you want to know more. Then to talk about climate action, investment and growth. The OECD has just produced a new report, Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth, which revisits some of the arguments that we heard from our introductory speaker, Mr. Ray. Certainly this trade-off between long-term growth and action on climate now is one of the issues that addressed, and it came up with some very positive messages about how you can combine growth in the short term with longer term sustainable growth and climate action. And finally, just to say some words about scaling up green investment and finance. So just quickly, the origins of the climate agreement, 1992, the UN Framework Convention, in a world that was very different from the one we inhabit now. The aim was to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous interference with the climate system. And it was based on common but differentiated responsibilities, which meant basically that the developed countries, the Annex B, the developed nations in blue there, would take on most of the mitigation action, and the developing nations needed to worry about sustainable growth. Of course, as you can see from the direction of those lines, the world's changed dramatically. The UN framework did not anticipate the dramatic growth in East Asia in particular, and now the situation in terms of emissions is pretty much reversed from what it was back in the 1990s. So the fundamental question is, what sort of climate do we want? Do we want to make this low carbon, this low emissions transition? This is a set of results from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, fifth assessment report, where they looked at the results of big climate models that tried to simulate the future climate going to the end of the century. And if you're in a low emissions world, the sort of world that the Paris Agreement envisages, you get significant changes in the climate. These are not small changes at all. You get higher temperatures over northern latitudes and the continental land masses, and of course Kazakhstan, as we've heard from Katolis, being a land-based economy, continental economy, that's going to affect the environment and the climate here enormously. And then on the bottom are the projected changes in precipitation, which are far more uncertain, I would say, than the temperature changes. But again, you get some patterns where rainfall increases, somewhere where you get drying, and the Mediterranean region in particular, out into the Black Sea, that's going to projected to get significant drying. But what happens if we don't act and we end up in something that looks a lot hotter? So that's the business as usual, very emissions intensive scenario that the IPCC simulated. And you can see the temperature changes there are enormous. Projected temperature changes by the end of the century. In somewhere like Kazakhstan, you're looking at an average increase in temperatures 5 to 7 degrees maybe. That's huge. Just think what that would do to a temperature such as we had yesterday, where it was in near the mid-30s. And this is just an average change. What you get also is extreme weather. So think of 2010 and the Russian grain harvest and the fires there, and amplify that a few times, and you begin to get a feel for what sort of future this type of scenario would bring. And of course, in terms of precipitation, the changes there are also more dramatic, and you can see very pronounced drying around the subtropics and more intense rainfall in higher latitudes and at the equator. So that's pretty scary. It's a good reason for not going there. And that's really what the Paris Agreement is trying to avoid by setting a long-term goal where we go to a future that doesn't go above 2, in fact, goes well below 2, we think, if commitments are honoured. And they actually want to go towards 1.5 degrees, because some of the small island states and vulnerable economies are even worried by changes at the level of 2 degrees C. That's ambitious given the emissions trends that we saw earlier, but that's the goal, and it requires action from all countries, not just the developed countries, but also the developing countries. So everybody pretty much has submitted nationally determined contributions to emissions reductions post-2020. Kazakhstan has done so. These are going to be assessed on 5-yearly cycles, and there's going to be what the UN called progression, as in those commitments will get stronger and more aggressive as you go forward. And of course, there's an important role for climate finance to be played here, and there were commitments from developed countries in terms of the transfers that they would make to developing countries. There's also important roles for capacity building and technology. And all this is underpinned by a universal transparency framework that applies to all countries, so that we can actually see what countries are doing, other countries can have confidence that commitments are being honoured, and we can move forward together. Adaptation is going to be hugely important, and it's now recognised that even with a 2-degree future, you need to put that, in terms of importance, on the same level as mitigation action. And what countries will do is, on a 5-yearly basis, they will have a global stocktake of collective efforts to assess the adequacy of action to those targets. So this is a whole mechanism that's been set up by the Paris Agreement now, and it's in operation and will continue in operation despite the recent announcements from the US. Moving on, what do countries need to do? Well, this is a visual from that OECD report I mentioned earlier, and it shows that you need 3 broad fields of action. At the bottom in red, certainly you need policies that are going to target climate change. Our earlier speaker spoke of the importance of the carbon price signal. Absolutely agree, fundamentally agree there. Whether you do that through a tax or a trading system, that depends, and some might work better in different circumstances. What to do, though, is to get rid of the negative price signals, the implicit subsidies on fossil fuels. You also need to think about how you incentivize research and development, how you support new technologies like renewables to get into the market. So in the early stages of renewables, we saw large feed-in tariffs. These proved quite expensive because suddenly technologies fell in price far faster than people expected. And so governments were paying more money than they needed to produce these technologies. Now, solar is competitive with coal in India, for example. So you don't need such big subsidies to get these technologies into place. In some areas, like energy efficiency, you might need regulation. They're not very responsive, perhaps, to the price signal because of split incentives, asymmetric information between different partners. In orange, I've highlighted that you need a well-aligned investment environment. And this goes very much, I think, to the issues that are under discussion at this forum in Kazakhstan, how to improve that investment environment to generate the inflows, to generate the finance that's going to create this new economy, this new diversified economy. You need to have a very, very strong rule of law contract, policy stability. You need to have good competition rules. You need to allow for the free entry and exit of firms into different sectors. All these things underpin the transformation to a low-carbon economy and, in fact, complement and reinforce that. And this is where the pro-structural reforms come in. So you're going to need these sorts of actions to allow greater entry and exit of firms, to boost innovation. You're going to need fiscal measures, perhaps, to improve still further the infrastructure that's needed. Given some of the ideas and ambitions I've heard around the forum over the last few days, this is a very exciting time for Kazakhstan, and there's certainly scope to do that. And these come together to give you a future that actually combines a low emissions pathway with sustainable growth. Just looking at the challenge, countries face different challenges, and we know Kazakhstan has its own individual circumstances. This is a plot, again, from that same report, which looks at the G20 countries. And on the vertical axis, the y-axis, you have on the vertical axis the CO2 intensity of energy. And you can see at the very top, you have Australia, South Africa, China, very CO2 intensive energy, largely coal dominated. Coming down you have economies that have more of a mixed energy supply. And then coming down further, you see France down at the bottom. And the lines there, the 2020, the 2030, the 2040, the 2050, they represent the points that are consistent with a well below 2 degrees scenario as projected by the IEA in their companion report this year also. And there's two dimensions on this. I've mentioned the CO2 intensity on the vertical axis. On the horizontal axis, you've got the energy intensity of GDP. So you can see that a number of economies are very energy inefficient in terms of the energy required. And Russia, Canada at the extreme, China even. And then again, coming through, you've got a bunch of the more either emerging economies with large agricultural sectors like Indonesia, Brazil, or France, UK, where you have quite a good performance in terms of energy, final energy per GDP. And one of my staff very quickly put a Kazakhstan bullet on there. We said we didn't do this analysis for Kazakhstan, but we think it's about there on these metrics. So extremely CO2 intense because of the large coal generation, and still relatively inefficient in terms of energy per GDP. There's scope for progress in both of those dimensions. And just to illustrate the pathways, the emission pathways over time that are consistent with this well below 2 degrees scenario, we have the green line there of what would happen to to G20 emissions on average. And you see that they come down by 80% or so by 2050. High-income countries are doing more than that. Upper middle-income countries, they have a little bit of a pause before they really start to reduce, but they also reduce below the G20 average. And those are upper middle-income countries that are also G20 countries, so it doesn't include Kazakhstan. And then the lower middle-income countries, where the poverty challenges are most severe, obviously they have more time to achieve these targets, and so their transformation is slightly slower and isn't as complete by the end of the 2050. But by the end of the century, all economies have to be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions to be consistent with the Paris Agreement and to stop climate risks growing. Because what drives climate change is the cumulative level of CO2 emissions. It's not the emissions in any one year. And so you actually have to go to net level of zero to stop those risks rising. And that's a very clear message that came out of the last IPCC, and one that the Secretary General of the OECD has been championing for a number of years, and now it's reflected in the Paris Agreement. So what does all this mean for growth? Well, this is for an average of selected G20 economies from that same OECD report. And it actually shows that, yes, you need to invest to decarbonize, and you need to invest also perhaps to offset some of the effects that mitigation measures might have on other sectors of the economy. They might reduce investment in some areas, so you might need a fiscal stimulus to keep growth going. But if you couple mitigation action with these fiscal measures that are consistent with boosting productivity in the medium term, with these structural reforms to allow a more competitive economy where firms can come and go more easily, where you have lots of green innovation, you can offset this negative impact from energy prices or stranded assets in countries that have very fossil-intensive economies. And you end up with a net effect in GDP by 2050 that's actually slightly positive. I mean, we're not making that as a big figure, but this is showing that climate action is consistent with continued growth out to 2050, with a slightly positive effect on GDP, typically, we think. And then if you add in the avoided damages, because climate damages will mount as we go through this century, you get a far bigger effect. And this goes very much to the point that Mr. Ray was making at the start. There is no growth path that gives you high fossil-intensive growth in the long term that's sustainable, because the climate damages will come back and bite you. And we don't know how to model these perfectly yet, but we know the effects will be negative, and they could be quite severe. Now, of course, this pattern will be different in different types of economies. I'm just trying to get this to click on. It doesn't seem to want to move. Excuse me, is the clicker working? No. So we looked at 4 stylized types of economies. These are the G20 economies. And this is not absolute growth rates. This is the difference from pursuing policies as we have now, which is rather low growth, low investment, some climate action, but fairly modest. And if you change from that to a scenario where you're actually trying to achieve the Paris agreements, you get this positive effect that I mentioned across all economies by 2050, and only in the most intense emerging economy fossil fuel exporters do you even get any shift down in the growth rates from the baseline growth. So say this is an economy growing at 6% a year, which we just heard from Katoa's Kazakhstan is, then this would still be positive growth. This is a very small effect on that growth rate. So action, even in the most intense fossil fuel exporting emerging economies, we think is consistent with continued economic growth. But you have to have good governance, you need to have good policies, good investment frameworks in place to allow that to happen. And that's why the broader reforms are needed. Just quickly, because I'm conscious I'm taking a lot of time, how to mobilize green investment. The OECD has been looking at this for many, many years, and there are several components to this. It's like a recipe book. You need this enabling environment that I mentioned, the investment environment, the competition environment, the rule of law. You need the financial deepening that the financial center will hopefully bring to Kazakhstan. You need that financial deepening. And you need these policy regimes that are transparent, stable, and credible for climate goals. It's the carbon prices, getting rid of the fossil fuel subsidies, the R&D, and so on. You need to actually reduce the risks because some of these technologies are still relatively new in some settings. There are FX risks, there are country risks, there are all sorts of things that may put off institutional investors, conservative investors from putting their money into these things. So you can help. Public institutions can help by putting in guarantees, insurance, various sorts of risk mitigants. You also need to achieve scale, warehousing, scaling up bundles of projects so that you can then securitize them and get financing at scale, helps reduce the transaction costs for all this. You need transparency and standardization. That's the importance of the Financial Stability Task Force, report of the Financial Stability Task Force on climate risks. You need to have disclosure of risks. Investors need to know what the risks are associated with the financial instruments they're investing in. And lots of public finance interventions. So you can have specialized institutions like green investment banks that can put a lot of these things together in a way that's suited for the local market. And there's some brochures there that you can download on the web around green banks and green bonds that you might be interested in. And just I think I'm going to skip through this pretty quickly. Just an illustration of where Kazakhstan is. Huge coal generation. A lot of that's very old. You don't need that anymore. India is now auctioning solar PV at prices that are now cheaper than thermal coal in India. So you don't need to invest in inefficient projects that are actually going to be a drag on your economy in the long term. Lost the clip again. Okay. 80% of the coal plants are older than 30 years. So you've got an opportunity here to begin that dramatic shift to renewables to replace some of this power. You can still use some gas for a long time to come. The real problem here is the coal that's locking in emissions in a very inefficient way and eating into the carbon budget that's allowed under the Paris Agreement. It's very stringent. There's only 15 to 30 years of emissions at current rates for the world to stay within that 2-degree limit. I'm not going to go into that, but we've done some other work that we can talk about later to understand the empirics of how those policies work with renewables, to encourage renewables, which I think will be very interesting for Kazakhstan going forward. And that's just an advert for our Green Finance Centre, where we've brought together the different strands of advice in the OECD to create a platform that makes it easier to engage with external partners, such as perhaps Kazakhstan, on these issues. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon, for the very comprehensive remarks on the consequences of inaction and the pathways from Paris and some of the critical steps that need to be taken in order to reach those targets. Now, I did promise this was going to be an interactive discussion, and I'm conscious that Mr. Chong is going to have to leave us shortly, so I'd like to see if there are any questions on the material thus far, if the audience has some input or a contribution to make. I'm going to ask a question because I think that there's been so much discussion around Paris, given recent developments, especially around the US's decision apparently to withdraw from the agreement. Although this topic is a financial topic, finance doesn't operate in a political vacuum. There is a political context, and I think we've certainly seen a shift in that context with a rise in populist sentiment in different capitals around the world, and that sentiment is often hostile to multilateralism and some of, let's say, the objectives of the Paris Agreement. So I would pose the question to Simon and possibly also to Mr. Chung to ask whether this shifting context, what is the significance of this shift, and how, if any, are there impacts on a country in transition like Kazakhstan?
I think the US decision is clearly one that's been taken by the President, but is not universally agreed with by the other actors within the US. So you see a lot of the states are continuing to take action. A lot of the companies are continuing to take action. Philanthropists such as Michael Bloomberg are stepping in to meet commitments that might not otherwise be met in terms of financing the UNFCCC Secretariat. So I think that people actually realize that the large part of this transformation is pretty much irreversible. You're now seeing these technology trends that mean it's just cheaper and cleaner and healthier to produce your energy with solar and wind than to belch out air pollution that takes such a toll on people's lives. We want to live in cities that have good infrastructure, good public transport, so they're not clogged up with cars. Again, this takes a toll on people's lives. This is a huge economic cost in the short term that actually is driving action aligned with climate policy. But actually, you want to take that anyway. The technologies are there, they're cheaper. Why would you not want to put them in place if they're giving you a better life? And the interesting point that was raised about diesel versus petrol cars also. Diesel produces a lot of NOx, which climate policies also typically haven't taken account of. So not only are you making the climate change worse with your diesel emissions, you're also making air pollution far, far worse. And it should be taxed for all those bads, all those missing costs, if you like, not just the climate one, which would argue for a higher rate on diesel than we have now. So I think there's a lot of momentum, just sheer technological, innovative momentum that will drive this change in many, many countries. But you can't get away from the need for policy and regulatory action to help support that as well. And so I think the point now is for governments to stand firm behind their commitments of Paris, and to move forward with what they've said they're going to do, which is to reduce emissions, put in place the policies. They're going to drive this transition, to do the regulation, put in place the investment frameworks that are needed to make this change.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. Would you like to add to that?
Thank you very much for the question, actually. I have been a diplomat for some time, but I'm no longer a diplomat, so I don't have to be diplomatic in answering this question. And of course, you know, there will be a very serious blow to the Paris Climate Agreement, because basically Paris Climate Agreement depends on self-declaration and pledge and review. So we all rely on integrity of the participants. But if some players are coming up with that kind of attitude towards their own self-declared targets, then the morale, where the Paris Agreement is depending on, I think it will be seriously suffer from a very serious blow. But on the other hand, this is a kind of a struggle between those who are looking back and those who are looking to the future. So it is the choice of each country or each politician whether you would like to look back and rely on conventional scenarios, trajectory, or you would like to be brave enough to go to a new world where the new vision is there. In that context, I would like to very much welcome the OECD work to show that green trajectory can be higher in economic terms, economic growth rate. So 2050, we can have even 2.5% more economic growth. That is the kind of message politicians need. But unfortunately, actually I was collecting those positive messages around the world. It's very difficult to find those positive messages. Rather, we are suffering from all kinds of messages that carbon tax, carbon pricing, all these things will damage our economic competitiveness, our industry, and the GDP will suffer such and such percentage by such years. For example, in Korea, in the United States too, there are many econometrics experts who are very good at coming up, oh, $10 or $20 or $100 carbon tax will reduce GDP by 0.5% by when? This kind of messages are always dominating international media. So I cannot blame the politicians and even business and people suffering from those negative messages or believing that, oh, climate action or carbon pricing is very bad for my country or very bad for my industry. Is it true? Because these messages are completely, for me, is false, and there's no basis for it, because the CGE model, where maybe Simon knows much better than me, this CGE econometrics modeling is the culprit, is the main culprit of spreading out those negative messages. If you don't agree, please tell me. I won't have more discussions later on. Because this CGE model is supposed to be only for a short-term projection. It is not at all designed for long-term trajectory like 2050. But still, nevertheless, these econometrists, economists are coming up with the negative messages of, oh, you will suffer minus 2.5%, whatever. So my point is that we have to come up with a positive message. We have to spread more OECD kind of positive message around the world that climate action will, in fact, increase our economic growth in the long run. But not many people heard about it, so we are suffering from a very bad and negative and the false and the messages. So I think we have to get out of this messaging war, and I hope OECD can lead the pioneering, spreading out the positive message. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chung. So I think I'd now like to bring the focus back from the international to the local. And we're going to open up a discussion around our project's findings. And I should just set the stage a little bit and begin by saying that Kazakhstan has indeed been a very enthusiastic proponent of the green economy and climate change mitigation thus far. The key policy document is the concept on transition to a green economy, which looks at various economic scenarios to identify priorities for action. And progressive laws have been passed also in renewable energy, energy efficiency, and the introduction of an emissions trading system, which will restart in January of next year. This is a summary of the key targets. I would highlight the nationally determined contribution of 15% unconditional, 25% conditional, a 30% reduction in energy intensity, and 30% of domestic energy generation represented by alternative and renewable sources of energy. And let me say that these are ambitious targets. To understand how ambitious, levels of Simon's presentation is highly energy intensive and uses 2 to 3 times more energy per unit of GDP compared to the OECD average. It's also the largest emitter of greenhouse gases in Central Asia, and the per capita emissions are among the highest in the world. They rank with Canada. And the industrial sector is 5 times the OECD and European Union average. Achieving these targets, therefore, will require a very significant scaling up of finance from public and private sources. So I'm going to now bring in Dr. Yesekina into the discussion. I think that's a good point to bring her in. Dr. Yesekina is the founder and director of the very well-known local institution, the Green Academy. So, Dr. Yesekina.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, first of all, for organizing this event. And let me, as Mr. Katal said, that Kazakhstan has very ambitious goal for achieving a green economy. As you know, in 2013, President of Kazakhstan, Mr. Nursultan Nazarbayev, has adopted green concept in Kazakhstan, and we have a very ambitious indicators, very ambitious goal for achieving in our task, our goals in the water sector, energy efficiency, reduction of greenhouse gas, and in other sectors. And according status of implementation of green concept in Kazakhstan, let me inform you that in Kazakhstan, working during last 3 years, Green Council under President of Kazakhstan, Mr. Sagintayev is chairperson this council, and in last meeting was held in 2nd June, and in this meeting has adopted working plan and reports from each regional government for achieving green indicators in this concept. And I am a member of this council, and we plan to discuss national report of achievement of indicators of green concept in this year, starting since September. And let me focus now in our achievement of our goal in climate change in greenhouse gas emission. Next slide, please. As you know, and our colleagues from OECD also note that Marrakesh conference also suggested to government to prepare some low carbon development strategy. And let me share our experience on implementation our NDC. Next slide. And Marrakesh outcome also suggests to middle income country and low income country to update NDC to develop low carbon strategy on the national level. Next slide. And Kazakhstan has adopted NDC in last year, and in November last year, our president ratified Paris Climate Agreement, and now our scientists from Green Academy and with by support Ministry of Energy and with participation Ministry of Education, now we continue our investigation of how Kazakhstan should implement Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide. And this is our step on achievement NDC. And as you know, in April was adopted some additional point to ECO Code about restarting of emission trade system in Kazakhstan. Next slide. And present situation is very difficult for increasing energy intensity of GDP and carbon intensity. If we calculate these indicators with OECD, Kazakhstan has energy efficiency indicators. Our energy efficiency indicators cover, for 2-3 times we use more energy than OECD country. Next slide. And this situation, the same situation in transport, unfortunately, in transport, in mining sector, and also in building sector also. In the present, many enterprises and especially from extractive industry try to invest to green technology, and also try to attractive international investment. In last month, we received information from Green Climate Fund that Green Climate GCF has adopted readiness application of Kazakhstan. I think it is also good news for future implementation of Paris Climate Agreement. Next slide. And according to renewable energy, it's a very difficult situation, as Simon noted, that Kazakhstan present only 1% of renewable energy in energy national energy balance. It is also very difficult goal for achieving these indicators in green concept. And as you know, in the opening ceremony of Expo, our president has noted that to 2050, Kazakhstan should produce around 50% of renewable energy. It is also difficult, but now we hope that government and by support IFC, maybe center, maybe by support international community, to prepare some recommendation for revising energy policy in Kazakhstan. Next slide. And this is dynamics of greenhouse gas pollution till 2013. This is scenarios calculated by expert of Green Academy by support USAID program. And this is our vision how different sectors of Kazakhstan should implement national indicators in greenhouse gas pollution sectors. Yes. Next slide. And our vision, we think about development of national strategy, national low carbon strategy. We think that this strategy should investigate or include 3 main directors. First of all, energy efficiency, increasing of energy efficiency, then develop of renewable energy, and develop of or restart emission trade system. As you know, till now, emission trade system Kazakhstan close, but since 2018, we hope that Minister of Energy with government to start emission trade system in Kazakhstan. And present Ministry of Energy to prepare new indicators for national low carbon plan. This is methodology based on using of benchmark approaches. And we hope that new or restarting of emission trade system also led to Kazakhstan to start a process of implementation of Paris Climate Agreement. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Yesekina, for filling in some of the detail about these targets and what Kazakhstan needs to do to achieve them. Obviously, this is going to cost a lot of money, and it's important, therefore, obviously, to know exactly how much this is going to cost, the scale of financing that's required, and that was the first task of our project, and what we are going to present now. We're moving into our project findings. My colleague Jürgen Weissman is going to take us through now some demand assessment modeling that we did to quantify the scale of financing required. So Jürgen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katalos, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Katalos introduced earlier, one of the key tasks of our project is to analyze the demand for green investment. This is really, there are two goals behind that. So one is from the perspective of the overall green financial system to understand the challenge of like how much finance has to be mobilized to achieve the targets for the green investment. But also from the perspective of financial institutions, whether they're domestic or whether they're international, to really understand how large are the opportunities and in what sectors are the opportunities in order to get involved for the financing of green investments. So I think, Katalos, you had already introduced these targets, so I'm going to skip with this and then move into my presentation here. So overall, the demand for green investment is really driven by two strategic policy documents. One of them is the Green Economy Concept, which Mrs. Yesekina has already introduced very well. And the other one is the nationally determined contribution, which is Kazakhstan's commitment under the Paris Agreement. So for the Green Economy Concept, there are three areas where green investments are envisioned. So one is on the side of energy demand. So here it's really about reducing the energy intensity of the various industrial sectors. Then on the energy supply, and it's really about replacing very carbon-intensive sources of energy, such as coal, with carbon-neutral sources of energy, such as renewable energy. And then there are also non-energy related sectors of the economy, such as waste and wastewater, where we can also reduce carbon emissions just in a non-energy kind of way. If we look at the contributions in these three areas, if we just look at greenhouse gas emissions, so they constitute the national plan, but they should also add up to the international commitment, a reduction of 15% in greenhouse gas emissions compared with the 1990 baseline. So if on the left-hand side of the next chart we look at the history of greenhouse gas emissions, so we can see so that 1990 actually symbolizes a high point in greenhouse gas emissions in Kazakhstan, and throughout the 90s for well-known reasons. So it is a decline in the economy, but that was also accompanied by a decline in greenhouse gas emissions. So since about 2000, so they've been increasing again. And what we can see here is that the target of a 15% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions compared with 1990 basically means stabilizing greenhouse gas emissions from where they are today in 2015, 2016 levels. But this also means like breaking the strong upward trend that we have seen in recent years. Okay, so in order to reach this target, so we really need to look at measures that are taken in various sectors of the economy. So here we have identified the power sector, industrial sector, transport sector, and then looking at like what is the investment required in each of these sectors to achieve that. So the approach that we are taking there is that for all of these sectors, we look at all of the major possible ways to lower greenhouse gas emissions. And then we have to see so how many of, what is the total amount of emission reductions that we need to achieve? So compared with the potential that we have for all these different reduction activities. So what's the share that we really need to achieve the targets? And then for all the measures we have identified, then we will rank them by how much they would cost. And the measure we are using here is the cost per emission reduction, or the cost per 1 ton of carbon emission reduction. So it's a measure we are using, and we would rank, like on the right side, we'd rank the lowest cost alternatives first, and then progressively get to higher cost alternatives. And oftentimes it will turn out that there's quite a lot of activities that can be undertaken that actually have negative costs. So these are mitigation activities that can already be implemented now, and they are profitable for the companies that are implementing them. And then we'll also see that at some point we will reach a break-even point, and then from there on, activities will be progressively available at higher and higher cost. Now here we see the costs, they go up to $100 US per ton of CO2. And just to put that into perspective, so in the EU ETS system, so the highest prices that were ever reached were about 35 euros per ton of CO2. And currently the prices, of course, are much lower, around 5 euros per ton of CO2. Just to put that into perspective on the kind of activities that can reasonably be expected to be implemented. And then the further we move to the right-hand side, so then it also suggests, well, there's a need and a demand for support, whether it is from the national government sources or from the intervention of international players like the multilateral development banks that can provide some support. So the more we move to the right-hand side, the more support is needed. Okay. For this assessment, so we're working closely with Nazarbayev University. They're running a sophisticated economic model, and we're also using an earlier study from the EBRD that is looking into the cost of these mitigation measures. This is still work that is ongoing, work in progress, but I can already share some data with you. And we are going to be looking at the costs and mitigation activities in 4 sectors. So we'll start with the power sector. We're going to move into industry, into the municipal sector, and then also into the transport sector. So the purpose of this is really going to give people an idea of what kind of activities we are going to see, but also for the financial industry to identify industries and certain activities where financing from their side, there may be opportunities for doing that. So if we look on the power, for the power sector, the big focus is, of course, renewable energy. And we see on the very left-hand side, so there's quite a large opportunity for wind power, which can already be profitable, keeping in mind that this always depends on the level of government support and then, of course, in Kazakhstan, also on the level of the exchange rate. So this is based on a 2011 study. And of course, we are aware that the changes in the economy and with the exchange rate have recently affected those numbers. So it's those kind of changes that affect the competitiveness of this indication. It's also the level of feed-in tariffs that affects the competitiveness of these alternatives. But here we see in general, it would be wind power first, then small hydro, then solar, and then large hydro is already quite expensive in Kazakhstan. So let's take a look at the second sector, so that would be the industrial sector. And here we can see so that there's actually a lot of industries where we already have opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions at relatively low cost and profitable means. So we can see, so there's about 20 million tons of CO2 that could be reduced per year across various industries, including oil and gas sector, steel industry, lime industry, various chemical industries. And there's also, and then there's also opportunities in a number of additional industries, so where the costs are positive, but still in a realistic range. Okay, let me flip quickly through municipalities that we see. Here we are talking mostly about investments into district heating, but also in energy efficiency of buildings, and then also waste and wastewater. And so maybe just in the order of cost, so the first opportunities are really in changing boilers for district heating systems, in updating them or putting in new boilers. And then there's quite a lot of opportunities in the building sector, so it's about a break even, and then for waste and wastewater, so that actually is only available at significant cost. So let's go to the transport sector. So we see here, so there's not that great opportunities, but they're very profitable opportunities, both in passenger transportation and in public transportation and buses, and also freight transportation for trucks and lorries. So, I have 3 final slides on the 2 scenarios that are being modeled by the Nazarbayev University. So this is also shown. It's a scenario on the left-hand side. It's also is a scenario that is based on the current measures, policy measures that are already taken, including the ETS, the feed-in tariffs, and it also includes the plans to, at some point, use nuclear energy in Kazakhstan as well. And then a scenario on the right side that considers additional measures that would actually be needed to reach the goal that is in the nationally determined contribution, that is stabilizing the greenhouse gas emissions. So additional measures that would be needed. So if we look at the energy use overall in Kazakhstan, so the overall level wouldn't change very much between the two scenarios, but we would see that that in the enhanced scenario, we'd use a lot more renewable energy sources and reduce the use of coal. And then if we just look at how power is produced, so then we see this effect even more pronounced. That renewable energy would actually, in order to stabilize emissions, provide a very, very significant contribution. So how much will all of this cost? What is the overall demand for green investment? So we are still crunching the numbers from Nazarbayev University. But I would just like to leave you with this chart. The figure on the right, 3.3 billion per year as a long-term average through 2050. That is a number that has been estimated by the Kazakh government in order to implement the green economy concept. This represents about 1% of GDP on average. We have received feedback from our advisory group that at least in some countries like China, even 3% of GDP would need to be spent on green investments in order to stabilize the environmental situation. And it compares with the current level of investment in 2015, 374 million US dollars, so it's obviously it's a big gap. So it's only 15% of that is what is needed over the long term. So there's a lot of work ahead for the green financial system in mobilizing funds, but there are also a lot of opportunities for financial players to get involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jürgen. So I think we're almost on time, in fact. So very well done. So far, we've heard about the why. Why are we pursuing this and recommending this green economy transition? We've heard from Simon that the penalties, the consequences from inaction are severe. But we've also heard, in a positive sense, importantly, that action can be growth enhancing. And thus far, we've been talking about the what needs to be done. We've set out the targets that the government has committed to, and they are ambitious targets. We've modeled the investment that is necessary and will be required, but at the same time, the opportunities in which sectors and the scale of opportunities in each sector. We also need to look at, can we go back to the presentation, please? We also need to look at the capacity in order to achieve these opportunities. And specifically, the capacity of the financial sector. Next slide, please. Next slide. So we posed the question whether Kazakhstan's financial sector has the capacity to meet this required demand. Can we go to the next slide, please? Ishoris. Okay. So we looked at, in depth, Kazakhstan's financial sector. We looked at the domestic financial system, public and private institutions, the financial institutions, the financial markets. We surveyed the landscape, and we looked at the regulatory framework. And my colleague Vadim will talk about the regulatory framework in a second. So the methodology that we applied is a fairly simple one. Each level of activity reflects a progressively deeper and more substantive set of activities, beginning with voluntary commitments and standards such as Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative and the well-known principles for responsible investment, We then looked at business process integration, the integration of climate change aspects into financial institutions' rules and risk assessments. And so this is reflected in initiatives such as the Equator Principles and green roadmaps. We then looked at a deeper level of actually financing dedicated green investments and projects covering multiple sectors. And then finally, originating and developing dedicated sector products and services. So what did we find? Well, we found a shallow financial sector. I think that's well known in both absolute and relative terms. Kazakhstan's credit and deposits GDP lag behind their peers. We found an underdeveloped securities market, which during the early to mid-2000s experienced rapid growth but has slowed down recently and is currently largely inactive and illiquid. In the banking sector, we found a low equity base, high NPLs as a drag on credit growth, and foreign banks that have either retrenched or not extending the levels of credit, that the level of feed-in tariffs following the currency devaluation and an ETS in suspension. And looking at the specific levels of sector capacity, this landscape is also unsurprisingly shallow. Voluntary measures are patchy, process integration is very limited, and whilst some limited investments have been made in the renewables sector, there are no investment mandates, and banks to date have provided low and limited levels of green financing. And of course then, there have been no dedicated green products developed to date. So it's a shallow sector at this moment, but a sector that represents a blank page from which to build upon. And I think we should turn to the regulatory environment now, building on what Simon talked about and how important rules and regulations are in creating a positive enabling environment. And so I'd ask my colleague Vadim Ni to share with us some of our findings there. Thank you, Vadim.
Thank you very much, Catalyst, for the opportunity to present the preliminary results of our second stage of our project. I will continue my presentation in Russian. Добрый день, дамы и господа. Я хотел бы в рамках своей презентации остановиться на предварительных результатах второго этапа нашего проекта. Вы смогли посмотреть, как мы видим в разработку зеленого финансирования применительно к Казахстану, изучая международный опыт, рассматривая возможности для реализации Парижского соглашения. В моей презентации я хотел бы сфокусироваться на одном аспекте. То есть, когда мы говорим о зеленом финансировании, мы должны понимать, что финансовая система реагирует на потребности в зеленых проектах и реагирует на экологические сигналы, которые существуют в современном мире. Да? То есть это ответственность за финансирование определенных проектов, это вопросы, связанные с адаптацией к изменению климата. И в целом, и предварительно, я остановлюсь на том, что, конечно, наша система пока очень слабо реагирует на современные вызовы, связанные с финансированием, с потребностями финансирования зеленых проектов и с возможностями к адаптации к изменению климата, потому что финансовая система, финансовый сектор это тот сектор, который тоже должен адаптироваться к условиям изменения климата. В рамках своей работы я рассматривал следующие сектора, это банковский сектор, это страховой сектор, это рынок ценных бумаг, и это, значит, накопительная пенсионная система, возможности для финансирования через фонды и банки развития и углеродный рынок. Углеродный рынок, который основан на квотирование выбросов парниковых газов и охватывает примерно 50% наших текущих выбросов парниковых газов, поскольку это та система, которая впервые попыталась сблизить наши потребности в охране окружающей среды, в реализации зеленых проектов с финансовой системой. Я сам непосредственно разрабатывал основные документы, которые были необходимы для запуска системы квотирования и торговли выбросов парниковых газов. И помню прекрасно, что мы с трудом пытались понять друг друга с людьми из финансового сектора, поскольку мы, люди из экологического сектора, очень плохо понимаем, как работает финансовая система, различные сектора. И зеленое финансирование – это возможность, конечно, нам сблизить позиции и понимать друг друга. И отдельно я хотел бы в рамках своей презентации остановиться в возможностях Астанинского международного финансового центра, потому что это и особый правовой статус, и особый налоговый режим, это и особый статус с точки зрения развития новых инструментов, новых финансовых инструментов, которые нужны для зеленого финансирования. В отношении банковского сектора нужно отметить, что пока система крупнейших банков, она очень плохо показывает восприятие потребностей в зеленом финансировании, не отсутствует положение, если мы говорим о корпоративной социальной ответственности банков, то там практически в большинстве случаев отсутствует даже положение, касающееся экологической ответственности. Конечно, эти вопросы менее значимы, когда мы говорим о потребительском кредитовании или ипотечном кредитовании, но они становятся необходимыми, когда мы говорим о финансировании через банки инфраструктурных проектов. И такие потребности сегодня существуют. Сегодня многие проекты в любом случае проходят и ориентированные на финансирование зеленых проектов, они в конечном итоге проходят через банки второго уровня. И, естественно, мы должны видеть систему зеленого финансирования, как от Международного финансового института деньги проходят непосредственно до разработчика проекта, и мы должны понимать, как система работает и как система зеленого финансирования предоставляет нам возможность реализовать те или иные проекты и достигнуть тех или иных целевых показателей в отношении зеленого финансирования. Пусть это касается сокращения выбросов парниковых газов или увеличения энергоэффективности тех или иных проектов. И сегодня, конечно, в рамках национальной системы у нас отсутствуют критерии для определения зеленых проектов. Да, в рамках системы квотирования и торговли парниковых газов у нас есть список проектов, которые субъекты квотирования могут, то есть единицы от сокращения, от которых могут приобретаться, чтобы покрыть часть квот. Но это только единственная и отдельная система, где существует какой-то определенный перечень. Что касается финансовой системы, ее нет. И, конечно, отсутствует в целом информация, касающаяся экологических аспектов деятельности банка. В основном мы оперируем вопросами оценки экологических рисков в рамках системы экологического законодательства, оценки воздействия на окружающую среду, и банк уже воспринимает проект, как, если это не говорить, конечно, о таких, то есть о международных банках, как готовый проект, где кто-то уже оценил эти риски сами заданными объемами страхового покрытия. В результате эта система не приводит к формированию системы оценки экологических рисков. И она тем более необходима в условиях, когда речь идет об изменении климата и потребностях оценки климатических рисков. Это вот еще одно направление деятельности, где необходимо интегрировать вопросы климатических рисков в систему оценки рисков в страховом секторе. Что касается, значит, рынка ценных бумаг, Проект сконцентрировался на вопросах зеленых бондов. И здесь мы пока видим в Казахстане, что основные потребности финансирования проектов через зеленые бонды, она прежде всего видна на уровне местных исполнительных органов. Вы сейчас видите, в Астане есть проекты, которые реализуются, которые мы могли бы назвать зелеными проектами. Те же автобусы-гибриды, которые буквально были закуплены транспортной компанией города Астаны до Экспо. Но, к сожалению, если мы попытаемся реализовать эти проекты в других городах, и даже в Алматы, то финансовая система не позволяет их реализовать. И пока эта система скорее работает вот на командно-административных механизмах. То есть нет возможности для того, чтобы местные власти могли привлечь ресурсы для реализации таких проектов. Что касается пенсионной системы, я не буду останавливаться очень подробно на ней. Безусловно, поскольку пенсионная, накопительная пенсионная система должна приносить доходы, будущие доходы для нынешних поколений, то она должна учитывать риски долгосрочных вложений, связанные в том числе и с изменением климата. В отдельных развитых странах уже эти вопросы интегрированы в рамках пенсионной системы. Мы пока не рассматриваем эти вопросы, то есть это скорее вопросы уже к адаптации к изменению климата. Что касается, значит, финансирования через фонды и банки развития, здесь до меня были презентации, более подробно рассматривающие эти вопросы. Я бы отметил о том, что в бюджетном законодательстве пока что у нас нет отдельных линий для того, чтобы можно было обосновать расходы, связанные с развитием возобновляемой энергетики, с сокращением выброса парниковых газов. И отдельно вопрос, который сейчас уже ставится, с адаптацией к последствиям изменения климата. Здесь, конечно, предстоит более долгий путь, потому что необходима разработка политических и законодательных основ для реализации мер по адаптации к изменению климата и определение того, что мы понимаем под адаптацией к изменению климата. Что касается вопроса углеродного рынка, да, он у нас был на 2 года приостановлен. И сегодня мы видим, что перезапуск системы торговли выбросами парниковых газов, для того, чтобы эта система давала нам возможность для финансирования зеленых проектов и в целом приводила к сокращению выбросов парниковых газов, необходима система значит, увеличения обязательств по сокращению регулируемых объектов в рамках этой системы. В английском это звучит как, ну вот, в дословном переводе, как сжимание шапки, да? К сожалению, адекватных терминов еще в русском языке, по крайней мере, у нас не сформировалось, потому что только при достаточно жесткой шапке, да, возникает необходимость у регулируемых субъектов финансировать проекты за пределами своих предприятий, за пределами регулируемых объектов. В частности, это могут быть в лесном секторе, это могут быть более, скажем, мелкие установки и связанные возможности реализации мер по энергоэффективности на соответствующих объектах. В качестве примера можно привести, как это работает в тех же Соединенных Штатах. Да? Есть региональная инициатива по парниковым газам, там прекрасно работает система, значит, торговли квотами, да, поскольку квоты в основном, то есть полностью продаются, но при этом система не основана на вот таком жестких пороговых значениях, то есть жестких квотах по сокращению выбросов парникового газа. В то время как калифорнийская система меньше количество значит, торговли, меньше процент торговли, значит, углеродными единицами, но при более жестких квотах есть финансирование проектов по сокращению выброса парниковых газов. И сейчас в той же Калифорнии рассматриваются вопросы с тем, чтобы эти проекты финансировать. Раньше они финансировались за пределами Соединенных Штатов, то возможности финансировать только внутри Соединенных Штатов и, может быть, даже внутри штата Калифорния. Ну, что касается Астанинского международного финансового центра, сегодня многие, как я уже отметил, есть хорошие позиции для реализации системы зеленого финансирования на базе Астанинского международного финансового центра. Я отмечал уже и вопросы, связанные с налоговыми льготами, и возможности, отдельно как юрист отмечу, возможность принимать и разрабатывать нормативные правовые акты в рамках собственной процедуры. Потому что как юрист мы сегодня, и как многие мои коллеги, мы сталкиваемся с тем, что когда пытаемся ввести новые требования, мы сталкиваемся со сложностью нашей системы, когда мы не можем ввести новые регуляторы, поскольку есть система сложное согласование с бизнес-ассоциациями, с государственными органами, в результате которой мы, разрабатывая определенный инструмент, к концу всего этого процесса согласования получаем какие-то отдельные элементы, которые зачастую не работают, когда мы начинаем их применять. И со стороны различных заинтересованных сторон возникает, а почему был принят тот или иной закон, почему были приняты те или иные правила и почему не в таком виде. Потому что система не позволяет проводить целостные правила, что возможно, я думаю, в рамках Астанинского международного финансового центра. Ну и ряд положений, которые необходимы в рамках, это касается разработки политики самого Астанинского международного финансового центра. Это и вопросы, связанные с основными показателями по зеленой финансовой системе. Это и разработка различных положений, которые необходимы будут для запуска тех или иных инструментов. И эта часть касается поправок в действующее законодательство, где придется следовать существующей процедуре внесения изменений в действующее законодательство. Но вместе с тем есть возможности принятия собственных правил в рамках Астанинского международного финансового центра, которые будут действовать на его территории. И вы видите, что основные моменты, связанные с тем, чтобы мы определились с тем, что это такое зеленые проекты в наших условиях и как мы, с помощью каких инструментов их финансируем. Ну и отдельно вопросы, касающиеся разработки политики и законодательных мер с развитием зеленой финансовой системы за пределами в целом по стране, за пределами вот такого, скажем, пилотного участка в виде Астанинского международного финансового центра. Здесь нужно начинать с достаточно базовых вещей. Ввести в законодательство, в частности, глоссарий термин, чтобы мы, экологи и финансисты, понимали друг друга. И в конечном итоге дойти до того, чтобы мы могли разрабатывать проекты, реализовывать их, используя специальные финансовые инструменты и осуществлять их мониторинг. Я думаю, что это тот круг задач, которые в рамках следующего этапа проекта мы сможем уточнить, и тогда мои слайды могут выглядеть более красочно, пока они так вот обрисованы очень суровыми и грубыми мазками. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you, Vadim, for sharing with us some of the limitations to the current regulatory frameworks. And I know that you were involved in development of some of these regulations, so I'm glad that you're so self-critical. But thank you. So I would like to recap now before we move into a short break. I think we've heard from our speakers today that there is no turning back. The green economy transition is inevitable. The consequences are too great. But importantly, it opens up new opportunities and new pathways for growth. Second, the vision is there. Under the leadership of the President and the government, there are very clear and ambitious targets to put Kazakhstan on a pathway towards low-carbon green growth. However, at the same time, there is a great deal of progress to make. So we're going to move, following a short break now, we're going to move into our recommendations. So from the what to the how, and we have several colleagues that will present their thoughts on the emissions trading system. We have Lewis Redshaw from London that will be taking us through his observations and expertise in this area, what Kazakhstan should be thinking about in the second phase of the emissions trading system. We have Christian Brunning, our resident green bond expert, who will talk about the development of a green bond market, a demonstration financial product. We have Ian Henderson from UNEP, who will be taking us through market development, how to stimulate the market for green finance. And we will be talking about the roadmap, the timing, the role for the Astana International Financial Center in all of this. So we're going to break for 5 minutes, 10 minutes to get a coffee, and we'll be restarting here in 10 minutes' time. So see you shortly. Thank you. People from the coffee break, but I expect the caffeine will encourage them to return. So we're moving now into the how, the meat and substance of our work, the recommendations. And I want to start by saying that these recommendations are simply preliminary at the moment. To remind, we are in a consultation period at the moment, reviewing our recommendations, consulting with stakeholders. So we encourage you to provide input, ask questions, talk to us later, so that we can gather this input and develop a set of final recommendations, which we will present to the government in September at the closing of the Expo. So I'm going to cover very briefly transformation. We know that to move beyond the conceptual and just the talks of green economy and transition, to initiate a green financial system will require a scaling up of best practices and the implementation of reform. This process requires an understanding of the nature and the drivers of change. In a narrow context, drivers of change refer to individual agents or sponsors of reform, an individual minister or an individual ministry, a program, or a specific incentive. But green economy and a green economic transition, it's a complex system. And to reflect this complexity, we've moved away from a focus on the individual and individual reforms, and we've looked at a holistic understanding of the structural drivers that influence the success of transformation. In other words, we've come up with an architecture of change. As you can see on the left-hand side, we have the demand system for green finance, the priority economic sectors, renewable energy, efficiency, water, agriculture, where the demand is for green finance. On the other hand, we have the supply system, the regulatory environment, public incentives, the private sector, the key actors within the private sector, financial institutions, financial markets and products, and then, of course, the quasi-private sector, climate finance mechanisms, and multilateral actors. So to build bridges between the supply and demand systems, to help convert finance need into market activity, we've also identified important enabling mechanisms underneath. These are disclosure standards, reporting frameworks, public finance incentives, and we're going to talk about not every, but a number of these individual mechanisms in detail this afternoon. Overlaying this architecture is a national strategic roadmap. And we are recommending a national roadmap for green finance be developed at the presidential level. And this recommendation is intended to serve as an implementation program for the financial sector, so to lay out the key steps in this pathway of transformation. And the purpose of this roadmap is not only to create political capital, but also to regulate the pace and to regulate the tone of reform. A number of countries around the world have individual aspects of a strategy for green finance. You can look at work that China has done. You can look at work that Indonesia has done in specific tools. But often these individual actions are not connected up or synchronized. And it's a roadmap that helps link the dots, that provides the process to bring these elements together in a strategic way. And there are a number of interesting case studies in Italy and France that illuminate this perspective. In each case, they differ in specific features and emphasis, but they share a common vantage point in terms of surveying the system as a whole. So I'm going to skip through, and I'd like to ask my colleague Ian Henderson to look at and walk us through elements of how to stimulate the market and market development. Ian.
Thanks, Katulis, and good morning, everyone. I was speaking to Mr. Chung this morning, our Nobel laureate, and I said I worked at the UN Environment on green finance. And he said, you should think about the financial rules of the game. And I said, well, funnily enough, that's exactly what our team does. So the team I work for, as you can see in the top right there, is the very concise and pithy UN name, which is the UN Environment Inquiry into the Design of a Sustainable Financial System. And it was set up in 2014 to basically ask the question, is it legitimate to change the financial rules of the game to align financial systems with sustainable development? So the idea is this would be additional and complementary to the traditional ways we deal with environmental issues. And we can think about two traditional buckets of solutions. So one are real economy intervention, so carbon pricing or environmental regulation. The second bucket is public finance. And what we were doing was trying to think about a third bucket, which are these financial rules of the game. We've produced about 80 reports over the past 4 years, and you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk through them all. But we've produced one last year, and this slide summarizes the results. So basically, there's what we call a quiet revolution in terms of how the financial system is thinking about sustainability more broadly. The middle two bullets say there's a lot going on, but it's not enough. And the final point relates to what Katulis just touched on. How do you change from current momentum to transformation? And we've got a series of recommendations. So in terms of how we work, we don't have some grand theory or framework. We basically went into a bunch of countries and we listened to their story. And we worked with sectoral initiatives in that middle column. And also, like many colleagues in the room, like OECD, we've been involved with various international platforms that look at green finance. What we found in the first phase of work, in our first report, was perhaps to many people's surprise, not that a little was going on, but actually that quite a lot was going on to change the rules of financial systems and to bring them more in line with sustainable and green considerations. And a lot of the innovation was actually coming from emerging and developing economies. So what we're talking about are the kind of measures you don't normally associate with environmental or sustainable activities. So stuff by central bankers or finance ministries or regulators. stock exchanges, credit rating agencies. We released our second report last year, and basically this momentum has got bigger. And we're seeing this at a range of scales. In the market, we're seeing financial institutions do a range of stuff. Green bonds is the one we've all heard about, but there are green ratings and stress testing. So ICBC, one of the biggest banks in the world, has developed and released a environmental stress testing methodology, which is applying to all its credit portfolios. At the complete other end of the spectrum, there's stuff going on internationally. Simon mentioned the FSB, and there's also work in the G20 on green finance. I've talked about financial institutions, the sort of enterprise level, and also the international. And this slide tries to capture the activity going on at national level. So as part of our work, we tried to map what was going on. And we found examples in more than 60 countries of well over 200 measures where these players, these people that set the financial rules of the game, have effectively tried to incorporate environmental and sustainable considerations into the financial system. And this all shapes market development. So why is this change happening? And the blob in the center, I suppose, is the core of this. There's a new blueprint for the international community that we've heard about a lot over the past 2 days, the Paris Agreement, the Sustainable Development Goals. And to an extent, part of the momentum has been driven by those factors in the middle ring. So arguably, the financial crisis of 2008 and 9 has meant policymakers are more willing to step in and change the rules of the market. There's new leadership in sustainable finance that stretches far beyond the traditional seats of financial power, from China to Colombia, from Kenya to Bangladesh, and now Kazakhstan. And we're also seeing technological disruption. And in any sector, in any part of the world, it's very hard to bring about change, which is what we're effectively discussing, if the incumbents are settled and comfortable and profitable. And we all know that technology is going to disrupt every sector of every part of the global economy. And what this does is it's created momentum in different areas. It's created momentum in the markets by predominantly private actors. It's created momentum at the national level and also at the international level. Being at the UN, I talk in highly conceptual language that probably confuses you. So this slide is just intended to be a framework to think about what this momentum actually means. And I'm not going to go through all of it, but here are 5 R's. So if we take the top line, we're looking at policies and measures that not only mobilize new investment, but also try and reduce investment going to the unsustainable activities. Similarly, we're seeing activities with risk management, and this is quite interesting, the second row, where central banks are actually reinterpreting their mandates to incorporate elements of sustainability and climate risk. And we're also seeing responsibilities of institutions being redefined. So a bunch of regulators have basically told people like pension fund trustees that the kind of considerations we're talking about are part of their job description and mandate. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to let you speed read. There's a lot going on, but as I've said already, there's momentum, but it's not enough. And I think we can and we should celebrate momentum, but we've also got to be honest if it's enough to deliver the goals that we've set ourselves. And I think the summary is that directionally, there's cause for optimism, but the speed and the scale at which capital is being reallocated isn't good enough. So this begs the question of how do we move from this momentum, which is positive, to the transformation we need? In our last report, we set out these 5 steps, which we think are important components of that transition. So national strategies or roadmaps, it's so encouraging to see Kazakhstan is part of the leadership pack in that. We find that countries that move from the ad hoc interventions, the tactical, to a more strategic long-term, are far more effective and efficient, and also play a far greater leadership role on the international stage. FinTech is something we're all talking about, but perhaps we don't understand it as well as we should, and it's going to be a huge disruption. So what we need to do is try and not be evangelical about it, but try and understand what the potential upsides are and understand how we can harness them, and also try and understand what the downsides are and how we can mitigate them. I've talked a lot about stuff that can develop the market, and ultimately all this stuff that goes on at national and international level is predominantly focused at trying to allocate or mobilize predominantly private capital in the market. And part of the problem is no single metric can describe what success looks like. So as a sort of concluding series of verbal bullet points, we did some work trying to think this through and capture what was going on for the G20, for the Green Finance Study Group. And I'll just maybe read through what a vision of success looks like. So in the past 2 years, we've seen record capital allocation. So globally sustainably managed assets have increased by 25%. Digging down a bit, we're seeing record issuance of green products and securities. And we all know about green bonds, but we're seeing a more diverse pool of investors and also issuers. We're seeing tighter prices, greater ticket size, longer tenors. We're also seeing related products appear, so green ETFs, green bond indices are all emerging. And then we're also seeing a cascade of innovation down the debt spectrum. We're seeing new green loans tied to a range of sustainability and green criteria. We're seeing new tools right the way along the investment chain, from data providers, from investment banks, from asset owners. We're seeing new listing requirements, toolkits, and standards. We're seeing green investment funds, and obviously on the back of the green bond story, we're seeing the emergence of green bond funds. But there's also green private equity funds that have just risen to prominence in places like China. This is an embryonic area, and you need to share knowledge. And we're also seeing a huge spurt in the growth of those, so that the principles of responsible investment, for example, now cover, or their membership now covers, over 50% of the global assets under management. The same is true for initiatives in banking and insurance. And we're also seeing new and more ambitious principles and guidelines being set out by the private sector. So hopefully, not hopefully, I will end there. And hopefully, there's some steps to transformation that we think are important. It's very encouraging to see Kazakhstan is already dealing with many of them. And hopefully, I've just tried to paint a vision of what success might look like in the future. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ian, for the UN's experience, which is right, I have to say, at the leading edge, the work that the UN inquiry is doing. And we're very appreciative for your input and for Simon Zadek, your colleagues' input into our advisory board. Now I'd like to call upon Lewis Redshaw from Lewis Redshaw Advisors to walk us through his thoughts on Kazakhstan's ETS, some of the considerations involved there. Lewis is an expert in carbon markets and carbon trading. So, Lewis, over to you.
And thanks for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you all today and allow us to give you some thoughts, our thoughts on emissions trading and how the Kazakh emissions trading scheme might be developed, and really by drawing parallels with emissions trading schemes, existing emissions trading schemes, we are able to learn some lessons that will be useful for the renewal of the Kazakh ETS as it hopefully gets switched back on in 2018. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about price discovery, liquidity and efficiency, and we'll explore perhaps some of the more technical details of how to make an emissions trading scheme a success. And just for a bit of background, I started and ran the emissions trading business at Barclays Capital back in 2004. I ran that for 10 years, and I moved my team to a new company, and we work with industrials, with governments, with anyone that has exposure to carbon market risk, whether that's design or direct exposure. We work with those companies and institutions to help them understand the risk that they've got. We have a variety of functions. I won't dwell on those. the experience we've got as a consequence of doing a lot of trading volume over the years, mostly at Barclays, is really important. It's the practical experience of trading that allows the commentary on the best set of rules to allow an emissions trading scheme to be successful. So we worked on the documentation to help those markets trade. We were an official market maker on one of the exchanges. We facilitated the secondary market for CER trading, for example. We worked, there were some episodes of fraud in the EU ETS that we exposed and worked with the authorities to fix. We facilitated the broader financial sector getting involved in the emissions trading scheme in Europe by bringing money from pension funds and other institutions into the EU ETS. My own experience is with the International Emissions Trading Association as a director. The company traded more than 8 billion tons of carbon within my team. And that's more, we think, than any other company even today, even though Barclays doesn't trade carbon anymore, along with any other commodities, unfortunately. But 8 billion tons of carbon is an enormous volume, and it's that experience that we're able to draw upon to help other companies understand their risks and institutions to design the rules effectively. We currently work with a series of companies to do that. So hopefully that establishes our credentials to explain what is important to make an emissions trading system work. And I'm going to talk to you about liquidity. Let's define liquidity, how the EU ETS became so successful, so features that boosted liquidity and harmed liquidity, the role of speculators, how to control the negative impact of speculators, how the AIFC and an exchange might improve the functioning of the Kazakh ETS, and ultimately how to bring international investment to the Kazakh ETS. So defining liquidity, and these are really important points. For a market to be liquid, I mean, I think it's fair to say that the Kazakh ETS suffered from something of a lack of liquidity. But to have a liquid market, you need disclosure. We need to know what the price is, what the bid price is people are willing to buy at, what the offer price is that people are willing to sell at. There needs to be low barriers to entry. It shouldn't be costly to be involved in a market, both in terms of time, legal requirements, and indeed cash costs. Should be a low transaction cost so that it's easy, again, to do repeated transactions without spending a lot of money. There needs to be a narrow bid-offer spread. So that's the price at which someone is willing to buy is very close to the price at which someone is willing to sell, in order that if you change your mind, you can reverse the trade with minimal cost, and that encourages more trading. It needs to have a large number of participants. So the more people that are willing to buy and willing to sell, you can imagine there's much more competition to get that bid-offer spread close and tight, and indeed there'll be more trading because there's more requirements for people to transact, and more people transacting results in more transactions. And the other important definition is if you want to trade in a carbon market or any market, you want to be able to transact in the confidence that you're not going to move the market too much, that you're going to be able to buy the volume you need without having to chase after the price. So, for example, in the oil market, you could buy 1 million barrels of oil and you would barely move the price of oil globally. So you need to be able to buy what you want without having to worry about it. And my basic assessment of the Kazakh ETS, has that happened? So do we have price disclosure? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. We didn't know what the bids were, we didn't know what the offers were. Eventually, we knew what the traded prices were. The barriers to entry have been high. It's difficult to be set up in order to enter into a transaction. I must admit I don't know what the transaction cost was for trades in the Kazakh ETS. and there wasn't a narrow bid-offer spread during trading hours because no one even knew what the bids and offers were. There weren't a lot of participants, I believe something like 20 participants in the end in the Kazakh ETS, and with a market moving between 5 cents in dollar terms and more like $5, there was a very wide bid-offer spread, but also if you wanted to go and buy something, it looked like you'd probably have to pay up to get it. So not an efficient market from what we've seen so far. Now, the parallel everyone draws, the world's largest carbon market is the EU emissions trading scheme. What are the features of that trading scheme that made it so successful, that can be learned from, the features that boosted liquidity in that market? Now, the EU ETS had auctions, right? So if you have the government selling carbon and everyone having to buy carbon, you've instantly got, rather than getting completely a free allocation, you've instantly got a larger market. You've got the carbon moving from the government to companies via the market in some form. The auctions also help set prices. We've got banking. There's a low threshold, so there's wider participation. There's we've got rule stability. So the Kazakh ETS, for example, the rules appeared to change quite regularly, but in the EU ETS, the rules were set. And those rules were set for lengthening periods of time. So phase 1 was 3 years, phase 2 was 5 years, and phase 3 that we're in right now is lasting 8 years. So we've got stability for 8 years. And that's very important from an investment point of view, because if you know what the rules are going to be, that you're going to be short carbon and facing the prospect of having to buy carbon to meet compliance, you're more inclined to make the investment to reduce your emissions so that you don't have to buy the carbon. And if you know you've got a payback of 5 or 8 years, or combined 13 years to do that, then you're inclined to make that investment. The penalties in the EU ETS were enforced. At the moment, it's 100 euros per tonne if you don't provide as many carbon credits as you have pollution. And that acts as a very powerful disincentive from avoiding your responsibilities in the emissions trading scheme. And those rules are enforced. So it's one thing having a penalty, it's another thing actually enforcing that penalty. International offsets were allowed to be used in the EU ETS. Now that's caused some problems, but the most important benefit of that is that it allows more liquidity because there are more trades going on. You've got trades in the core allowances within the system, but you've got trades of those offsets too. The EU ETS is very big, and the revenue from auctions was not invested in too much technology that undermined the emissions trading scheme. But what Europe didn't do was probably more critical than the design elements that they did include, and they didn't have a mandatory exchange clearing, although exchanges do assist with price disclosure. They allowed the market to get on with whatever was required to meet the demand from the sectors covered by the emissions trading scheme. And the financial institutions came along and produced or provided product that fit the demands of those buyers. Anyone could get involved in emissions trading. So anyone could open a registry account, anybody could own EU allowances. And emissions trading was regulated in the normal way. So no specific regulations were implemented to restrict or otherwise the trading of carbon emission allowances. Carbon emissions trading was regulated the same way as coal trading or oil trading or any other commodity. There were no allocation changes. So if you're unlucky enough to be left short, needing to buy allowances, well, that was going to be your situation for 5 or 8 years. And if you were lucky enough to be over-allocated, well, you kept that over-allocation. There wasn't constant change to the free allocation that was available. And that means that all those companies come to market. If you're long, well, because you know you're going to be long in the future. If you're short, you've got to buy. And these are the things that are all boosting liquidity. I'm not necessarily saying they're right or wrong. There are inefficiencies in the EU ETS. But if you want high liquidity, you've got to stick to the rules. And if you're short, you stay short, and you've got to come and buy in the market. And that obviously boosts liquidity. There are several features in the emissions trading scheme in Europe that harm liquidity. And I'll go straight to the end of these. And we can... oh, there we are. So in the interest of time, but there are a number of lessons to be learned from the EU ETS where they've got it wrong. And we have those here. Now, there's one very important reason why the EU ETS has been a very successful market, and that's that the European electricity generation markets are fully liberalized. The interconnection between the different countries is good, so you can transport electricity from France to the UK, for example, via an interconnector under the sea. There's an awful lot of interconnection between France and Germany to Poland, and so on. So they're a very well integrated system. And the companies that are privatized are seeking to get as much out of the assets that they own as they possibly can. So they're constantly re-optimizing their generation portfolios. And a generation portfolio, as we've seen from Jürgen's analysis, even in Kazakhstan, is a mixture of gas and oil and coal in particular. And it's the same in Europe, of course. So, but each one of those generation technologies has a different carbon footprint per unit of electricity generated. So the change in the value or the price of coal, for example, will affect how much carbon emissions there are in the European electricity system as these utilities optimize the generation mix that they use to meet demand. So if coal price rises, then there's less coal consumed and more gas consumed to produce electricity, and there's less demand for carbon. In fact, the utilities will be selling carbon when coal price rises. When coal price falls, the opposite happens. And you can see a variety of outcomes that you can imagine happening every single day. So coal prices are moving all the time. Gas prices are moving all the time. But in a privatized electricity system, well, risk management becomes key to the financing of private ownership. So the electricity utilities are looking much longer term, typically, than in a regulated system. So the electricity utilities in Europe are hedging 3 years forward. So they're taking an account of their carbon position 3 years out from today. And all of this movement, this daily movement, results in those electricity utilities, and there's about 15 to 20 major ones in Europe. Every single one of those companies is in the carbon market every single day, all day long, optimizing and re-optimizing their electricity generation portfolio. And if we're talking about liquidity, the most powerful producer of liquidity in a market is the power sector, and in Europe's case, a liberalized power sector that is free to optimize its generation and to hedge its risks in the commodities markets that are related to it. So that's why the EU ETS has been so successful. I was asked to talk about speculators, and I'll quickly go over the role of speculators in the market, why they're important, and indeed how you might reduce their influence, the negative influences. So I'll talk about why they're bad for markets and why they're good. So speculators can lead to artificial volatility in any market, carbon included, and unscrupulous speculators manipulate markets to make profit. It's not unheard of in any market, let alone the commodity markets. But speculators are also extremely important to markets. So they are an extra source of liquidity because speculators are buying and selling depending on what they think is going to happen to the price. They help markets move to where they need to go. So if there's a regulatory change then they will be ahead of many of the other companies involved in emissions trading, and they'll get the market more efficiently priced more quickly. And speculators don't just buy. So then the fear of speculators is they're going to push prices up. But as an anecdote, when oil reached $147 a few years ago, I can guarantee that the best speculators weren't buying oil at $147, they were selling it. And if they were selling it, that means they stopped it getting to $148 or $149 or $150 or $160. So speculators also sell when they think something is overpriced. So it's not all one way. And what speculators do is they take away market inefficiencies. So for example, if the price of one commodity is very different to another and there's not a good reason for it, speculators will come in and correct that inefficiency by selling one and buying the other. There are also some hidden speculators. So it's all very well talking about hedge funds, investment banks and other companies speculating wildly on the price of something. But in emissions trading schemes, there are other speculators. So anyone that is long and doesn't sell is speculating that the price will be higher later. Anyone that's short but is waiting until the future to buy is speculating that the price will come down. And indeed, within the emissions trading scheme, if you're an installation in the emissions trading scheme, you're free to speculate as much as you want. And in fact, some of the biggest speculators in the European system are indeed the European utilities themselves. So by banning speculators, you don't ban speculation, if you see what I mean. So by banning foreign involvement in the carbon market doesn't mean you're not going to have any speculators. The incumbents, the people in the system, are speculating. And we have some examples within the EU ETS of people that are doing exactly that. The way to control speculators or the negative effects of speculation is to have some sort of price intervention. I can't quite see my own slides, so excuse me. And price intervention would stop speculators holding on to positions for too long. There are you can put limits on the amount of trading that individual speculators can get involved in, and that would stop price rises too far. So if you allow speculators into your market, you can just stop them owning too much of the commodity, and that directly stops the cornering of that market and then the pushing up of price. But perhaps the most important thing is a robust regulatory environment. So in Europe and in many Western economies, if you are caught manipulating a market, you can end up in prison. And so, of course, a severe punishment is a very powerful disincentive. But actually, probably the most useful thing to bear in mind when thinking of speculators is actually, if they think the price is too low and it gets to the price they think it should be, then they will stop speculating. They'll only be around when there's a market inefficiency to exploit. So my argument is that speculators aren't something to be feared, but if required, they can be controlled. And indeed, robust sanctions against market manipulation is probably the most useful thing to have in place, not a ban on speculation. Very briefly, what AAIFC might consider doing to improve the functioning of the Kazakh system. Pushing everything onto an exchange, which is how the Kazakh system's worked up till now, can have two effects. One, it can concentrate liquidity, which is a good thing. The second problem is it can create barriers. It can provide some solutions in terms of standardized contracts, but it creates a barrier to stop people trading. So forcing everything onto the exchange isn't necessarily a good idea, but if you're going to do it, you've got to do it in a manner that allows the widest possible participation. So, So to maximize the efficiency of the ETS in Kazakhstan, what AFC can consider doing is taking over the role of exchange provider and providing full price disclosure so everybody knows what companies are willing to buy and sell at. A permissive environment is essential. So it allows the market to naturally develop futures trading and the ability to go short should the market desire that outcome. But the permissive environment just allows the flexibility for it to happen. A more diverse participation by as many companies as possible by reducing the barriers to entry, so making sure it's not expensive to trade on an exchange, make sure that it's not difficult from a regulatory point of view to trade on an exchange, are all very important elements to maximize the use of the emissions trading platform that is put in front of people. Creating a link with a foreign exchange is an idea such that Kazakh allowances could be traded on an exchange outside of Kazakhstan, and something to think about. A market-making program by the government, such that directly, but the spread between EU allowances and Kazakh allowances. That's the kind of trade that I know that speculators and investors in Europe would have a look at. They would take the view, not necessarily the outright price of a Kazakh allowance, but the relative price of a Kazakh allowance versus the EU allowance. And that could well facilitate an exchange, if you like, a benchmark of pricing. And it will increase the interest of organizations outside of Kazakhstan in the Kazakh ETS. Lastly, and I'll skip through these, bringing international finance, international investment to the ETS, it's difficult. International investment banks are very cautious. There's been a lot of rule changes which puts them off involvement in a Kazakh ETS. I know, for example, having worked at Barclays, we wouldn't have got involved in trading in Kazakhstan or providing finance in relation to emissions trading in Kazakhstan because the rules weren't clear, and when they were made more clear, they kept changing. And so it's very important to have that stability in the system. But it's also important to remember that appetite in carbon investment globally is actually quite low at the moment because there aren't many places that you can put carbon credits into and make a profit. So California is the best example, but you can only produce projects and make projects in America and sell those things into California. So investment interest in carbon projects at the moment is very low. I think the point is to set expectations at a low level, create the environment in which people want to participate, and then interest will pick up over time. And obviously the key steps are to have a meaningful carbon price that people can observe, encourage domestic offset projects, because if you allow international offsets, unless they're of a very high quality, they're trading at such low levels at the moment that they would dilute the system. But domestic offset projects should be absolutely encouraged. And actually, that's the way to drive investment in a Kazakh ETS, is to get people to come and spend money on those projects, knowing that they can sell those carbon credits in a market and get that money back. Having a marketplace for emissions trading that's open to everybody. So all of industry covered by the ETS in Kazakhstan, as well as people developing projects in Kazakhstan that want to sell, that may not be from Kazakhstan, that want to sell their product, is very important. And if local institutions are assisting with the trading of emissions allowances, they lead the way and show international institutions what can be done and that it's working. That would obviously be a very important stepping stone along the way. So bringing international investment into the ETS is going to be a relatively slow process, but it's possible. And the reward for all the hard work of implementing a successful emissions trading scheme, well, the German government, the Emissions Trading Authority, have done a report. It got released last week, I believe. And the key quote from this report is that a good ETS can meet 94% of the Kazakhstan's emissions reduction gap. So a good, well-functioning emissions trading scheme can deliver the result you're all looking for with relative ease. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope that's been a useful interjection.
Thanks, Lewis, for this rich and realistic presentation on a very important market mechanism. I think we all know and agree putting a price on carbon is a critical step in accelerating the pathway to a low-carbon future. And I appreciate your words on the European case study, in particular, the role of different market actors, and importantly, the transparency and stability of the rule framework. So we're going to turn now to my colleague Christian, who's going to talk about another important market mechanism, green bonds, as well as a critical enabler in disclosure frameworks and green standards. Christian.
All right, good day, everybody. Thanks, Katolis. I'm going to dive into some of the more concrete recommendations that we put together. I'm going to start with looking at green standards. There's been mentioned by Ian today, there's a lot of activity internationally focusing on disclosure and standards. We've looked at these and tried to make use of some of the international experiences in the Kazakh context. After that, I will jump into the green bonds as a potential spearheading or benchmarking instrument that could come out of this work with AIFC. But starting with the green standards, they have a very fundamentally important role in any green financial system for two primary reasons. One is that they force information into the public, and actors act upon that information in different ways. And without that information, there's very few ways for market participants to react. The second important point is that by green standards and in use of standards, you harmonize. So people are talking about the same thing. You don't get you align views on what's green and how you should measure things, etc. So as I said, we've looked at a good number of international standards in earlier tasks during the project. And one sort of a general categorization that we've done is that if you want to somehow differentiate standards, you can do it and looking at certain standards that are essentially measurement standards. You want to measure something, whether it's the impact, how does that standard force somebody to measure, produce and calculate an impact, or how force a company to define the underlying environmental quality of an action. The second category is tracking standards. So essentially you're creating a system, you're forcing or enabling companies to track financial flows so that you can create information, you can create data of where capital is flowing, how it is flowing. And finally you have disclosure standards, which is perhaps a little broader category, but essentially provide information to evaluate risks by different types of stakeholders. The third aspect here is that, and this is coming from a recent OECD report, is that, I mean, at this point where you're looking at introducing new standards, you need to also look at how can you introduce these standards as part of standard financial regulation, especially in areas of systemic risk, in governance, transparency, and in ways of defining risk and materiality. So what this means is that green standards shouldn't just be looked upon as individual separate standards, but as broader, as part of a broader financial regulation. However, here in this presentation, our main focus is look at purely at the green standards, and in future work we'll look at how those could be integrated in some of the regulatory aspects that Vadim brought up earlier today. Now, one point I'd like to make here, and this is a bit of a reflection of where the standards and green market is currently, is that a lot of the standards are greenhouse gas, climate related. This is not to say that you shouldn't focus on other environmental aspects, but most of the body of work that's been done in this field is focused on greenhouse gas emissions. So while localizing international standards, you can of course bring in other environmental aspects that are critical for you in your area, whether it's for land remediation, toxic pollutants, etc. So just making this brief note that while a lot of the talk is on greenhouse gases and climate-related standards, it doesn't mean that that's the only environmental criteria that should go into the final adoption of the standards. So the way that we're looking at this now with AIFC is also see at what different levels of regulation do you have. And again, referring slightly to Vadim's presentation earlier, you can adopt standards at various levels of the regulatory framework that the AIFC is setting up. And this is one aspect of how we look at the integration of standards into the work of AIFC. So putting it simply, we have three levels of regulation. We have the AIFC Council and Authority, which is kind of the overarching management body that can adopt rules for the whole AIFC jurisdiction. Below that, we have AFSA, which is the financial regulator. And then under AFSA, we have the individual institutions in AIFC that can enact their own rules as well. So combining these different starting points for looking at the green standards, we get into a matrix that tries to place the different standards partly based on what their purpose is, whether disclosure standards, and also the level of regulation or the level of regulation at AIFC where they could be placed. I'm presenting here now five standards that we propose should be looked at more carefully in the context of providing the final recommendations, and then separately also looking at some of the green bond standards. So essentially we have two broader green standards that focus on the green finance definition. So you want to have a definition that is high up in the system as possible to ensure that all the players that operate within the system use the same definitions, and the same goes for tracking as well. You want to track finance, green finance, as broadly as possible. Then on the disclosure side, we move down a level, so essentially have the financial regulator adopt a voluntary disclosure standard, allowing financial institutions within AIFC to report on their climate-related risks and exposures within their normal financial reporting. And there's also risk and materiality aspect in these recommendations. Then below that, for specific products, you could have the AFSA adopt the Equator Principles, which is particularly focused on the project finance, and then specific disclosure rules for the exchange. In the interest of time, I'm not going to spend too much on each of these recommendations, just point out a few key aspects. So starting with the headline recommendation is to come up with a joint definition on green finance. And here the recommendation is to use the Multilateral Development Bank's common definition on green finance for all AIFC institutions. I'll get back to this point when I talk about green standards, but this would essentially provide a common list of project categories and subcategories for institutions operating, and that way allow them to define what's green financing in a common and harmonized way. And this list can, of course, be expanded to other financial institutions outside AFC, be expanded to a broader Kazakh context as well. The second recommendation relates to climate finance tracking and builds on the first one. So climate finance tracking is often seen as an enabler of funding, future funding, because as green financing needs to be compliant with the Paris Agreement, you need to be able to prove where the money went, what the impact of the financing was. So hence, you want to start tracking your finance to make sure that the projects you're funding are able to attract international climate finance. And the tracking framework is a precondition, or increasingly a precondition to that. So, so what we're proposing here is that the same source where the climate finance definitions came from is the common approach for tracking from the multilateral development banks would be used as the common standard for AIFC. And that would mean that projects are classified ahead of financing, and if they comply with the categories and subcategories, then you would track the funding going to those specific project categories. And again, this is an approach which could be easily adopted by other financial institutions in Kazakhstan as well. The third one is probably the broadest one, which is recommendations to adopt the recommendations by the Task Force for Climate Disclosures as a voluntary disclosure standard. This is quite a broad standard that covers different aspects of financial reporting and climate risk. But the point is that if you start it as a voluntary disclosure, you have a framework for how, against which financial institutions can start reporting on climate risk and how that climate risk impacts their business. And again, this is a measure to bring out information about not only the financial institutions, but also the underlying investments that they have. And you could look at different ways of introducing in this in separate stages. But this would be the basis for the disclosure within the system. And I should point out that the TFCD, as a standard, uses a lot of other standards. So this is more kind of a meta standard that adopts more technical standards underneath it. And then looking at the exchange, as we already mentioned, the sustainable stock exchanges have their own guidance for disclosure. There's recently been an extension to that, which is issued by NASDAQ as a special project for the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And this disclosure framework provides over 30 criteria that the exchange could require the companies to present and disclose in their normal reporting. So again, starting as a voluntary disclosure framework, using a clear number of criteria that should be reported, perhaps increasing those over time, with the pure interest of increasing the number of information that's coming out to the market. And finally, perhaps the most product-specific recommendation is to have an adoption of the Equator Principles. This, of course, deviates a little as it can be adopted as a requirement or a voluntary requirement, but ultimately it is the financing institution that needs to be part of get a membership under the Equator Principles. So what the Equator Principles essentially ensures is that the project financing going through to projects meets the IFC and World Bank environmental and health and safety guidelines. Has all 10 different topics, categories of criteria that needs to be met. But this is an example of a very product-specific standard that could be introduced with fairly low barriers, given that the structure of managing following up on the standard is managed by the Equator Principles Secretariat. We do have other draft recommendations or views of further standards as relates to wealth management and asset management, but those will be developed at a later stage. Right. So moving on to the next set of standards relating to green bonds. I'm taking somewhat of a step back here because the green bonds standards are part of the broader green bond framework that's being developed under the project. And just a brief recap, green bonds are essentially normal bonds, but they carry an obligation to deliver environmental benefits, and they carry an obligation to report on those, on how the funds have been used that you raised with the green bond. So as opposed to a normal bond, you have an added obligation to provide information to the market that where did you place the money and what the impact of that money was, and you need to do that regularly. So essentially, the green bond framework creates an additional level of process to a normal bond issuance process. So the AFC green bond strategy, how does that fit within the overall goals that we have for AFC, with the purpose of becoming a regional hub for green finance? We see 3 goals for the green bond strategy. One is to be able to localize international rules and standards for the Kazakh context, mobilize interest in green bond issuances through the Astana International Exchange, AFC Exchange, and then develop a reference green bond instrument. And underneath, we have a couple of concrete actions, which is creating a local network of companies and financial institutions interested in the green bond space, adopt international rules, localize them, make sure that the rules and guidance that you're putting in place is conducive to growing the market, finding a balance between rules and demand, and then providing a case study for how to grow a pipeline, how to develop a project, what is the process. So the final output of this piece of work is a strategy paper on green bonds. So it contains the framework that I just briefly described, a process for market discovery, making sure that there is local demand and receptiveness to the green bond framework, and then also a step-by-step guide to example green bond issuances. So how do we go about doing this? I'll go into the green bond framework separately, but essentially the idea is to come up with the green bond framework document, which acts as a central rule book, provides guidance as a manual for project participants in the market. It also establishes the leadership and an advisory committee's approval of the green bond framework. So there's clear support, leadership support. There's a process for market discovery by AFC, making sure that the framework is understood, is aligned with the market's interest, is aligned with the market situation in Kazakhstan. And then finding this balance between guidance and regulatory in driving the green bond market in Kazakhstan. And what does it then produce? Well, ultimately, it produces a reference for the Astana exchange. So it produces a criteria and a process for listing green bonds on the exchange. And it provides an example by having 2 example projects go through the green bond listing process. So as I said, the framework contains a number of steps that are built into it. You have to provide, ensure that you have endorsement, you provide guidelines, there's a process for oversight, and finally, and most importantly, that there's a process for mobilizing, activating interest, building the network, having the international networks, etc. I'm not going to go through all of this. I'll just mention a couple of the recommendations, of the draft recommendations coming out. So the first one is to create a green bond alliance in Kazakhstan, host a green bond alliance among key financial institutions, start as really as a hub for disseminating information among different institutions, get buy-in into the green bond market, understand what the market wants, what are the market conditions, and really be the sort of a focal point for this emerging green bond market in Kazakhstan. Second is just providing examples on the guidelines, how to adopt the international standards into the Kazakh context. So, as I mentioned, in the standards, the recommendation was to adopt the Multilateral Development Bank's definition on green financing. And here, that would be the similar starting point. So you need to be able to define what's green, what will be eligible under a green bond framework. And here, the proposal is to start with the same list of categories and see whether you need to define or redefine, take out or add certain project categories into that list, either in relation to other international standards or because of a market situation in Kazakhstan. So I mean, one obvious example there would be the MDB definitions include, for instance, remediation and energy efficiency improvements in fossil fuel plants. But you could have a situation where you decide that that's not an eligible category under the Green Bond Program, as an example. And then beneath that, you need to have sector-specific criteria for the green categories. So first you have the categories. What are the project types that are eligible under the Green Bond Program? And then you need to have definitions of how you define the underlying categories. And here you can rely on technical and environmental criteria from, for instance, from the climate bond standards. You can have technical standards from LEED or BREEAM for housing. The important thing is that you find an anchor so that you can, there's common understanding that what is the criteria for that project type. So what we're proposing is an adoption of certain international standards by AIFC, and the Green Bond Principles act as kind of a gateway. They're process-focused standards, so they ensure that issuers of green bonds follow certain steps, mainly in the 4 areas: use of proceeds, project evaluation, management of proceeds, and reporting. So this is kind of the starting point. This is the basic requirements that you would have for a green bond. Beyond that, you could have local eligibility. So you could have the definitions, local criteria for what project types are eligible, combine those perhaps with international definitions. And then you have a set of international criteria that relate to certain steps of green bond issuance process. I won't go into those now. And then what you have, you essentially have a 2-tiered green bond issuance process. So what you create essentially is a voluntary framework for green bond listings. So once you decide that you want to list a a bond as a green bond on the Astana exchange, you would have two options. One is to follow, and this is within the green bond framework, which is managed by the proposed committee, is that A, you can have a mandatory reporting. So the minimum requirement would be to have a second opinion. So somebody else, an environmental institute, provides a second opinion on your compliance with the green bond framework requirements, or you could potentially do a certification under the climate bond standard, and both those would be essentially the requirement for being adopted as onto the Astana, onto the green list on the exchange. And this, I just want to illustrate that it's really a voluntary separate process to the green bond, to a normal bond issuance process. So the green bond process essentially feeds from a decision that you want to issue a green bond. And then you have the normal bond issuance process with information memorandum and the standard bond documentation. You do the underwriting, you get the rating, you do marketing and issuance. And the green bond process essentially feeds into this specific information as a add-on material. So you would have then the whole process, just briefly discussed here, going from the criteria, matching project with the criteria, going into issuance and producing the second opinion to the main bond. So the point here is that it's a separate voluntary process that can be attached to the exchange. So concluding remarks, so the purpose is to create a localized guide for green bond issuances on the AIX, for AIFC to create and host a Green Bond Alliance, to drive the market, to find consensus, to grow demand, finding a balance between what the local market needs and what's an appropriate level of guidance and regulations, and then ensure that the Green Bond Framework is added on onto the, appropriated onto the, to the Astana exchange. And finally, to create a separate council to manage the framework. So these are some of the recommendations from the Green Bonds work and the standards work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christian. So I know Lewis and Ian unfortunately have to leave Astana in around 10 minutes' time. So I just wanted to take the opportunity, if anyone in the audience has some questions they'd like to address to Lewis on the ETS and to Ian and in general about market development, please, you're welcome. Please, do you have a microphone?
Kazakhstan requires not only green bond market, but also other markets, bond market, government bond market. Everything has to be developed. So I hope how could it be possible to make all the financial system comes into this process. That is also important, not only green bond, but also capital market. Secondly, the rate of return on green finance will be very important. How to increase the rate of return and how to make it very sustainable, and long-term investors, buy and hold, can also come into the market. Then the market will be gradually developed. So I hope I'd like to ask a comment about how to entirely develop the Kazakhstan market, not only green bond, but also other market, and what will the process will be recommended. And second one is how to increase the rate of return of the green bond, so that long-term investors also comes into the market.
Okay, thank you for your question. Maybe I can turn to Ian for the first part, the sequence of developing the market.
Yep, thank you. Very good question. And I think you're completely right. I think there are, if you think of a Venn diagram, there are definitely barriers to scaling up green finance that fall squarely into sort of sustainable finance barrier, that blob. So, for example, capacity or definitions or mispricing of externalities would fall into the green, sort of the green finance barrier block. But you're totally right. There are other issues which are just general finance issues, and the sort of the development of the capital markets is one. So I think there's a couple of points here. So international organizations like the OECD and the World Bank Group actually do focus quite a lot on local bond market development, for example. So I think you're definitely right. What we need to do is try and ensure those dots are joined. And I think there's also a bit of thinking now about, can we, for example, start integrating some of these green metrics of progress or success into broader financial market assessment. So for example, the IMF does these, I think they're called FSAPs. They're basically surveys of the state of a country's financial system, and they're quite influential. So for example, if you could integrate the green elements alongside the traditional capital market measures of progress, would that help rise or lift both boats at the same time? So you're right, there are definitely two categories of issues, and one category is general finance issues, and you've illustrated that point with bonds. Yeah, so it's a good question, it's very valid, and I think it's a question of joining the dots. Because you're right, there is a sequencing issue. There's no point in trying to develop a green bond market before the infrastructure is in place for the broader bond or capital markets. And I think that's partly links back to this point of a roadmap, is that what's very important is to move from these tactical ad hoc innovations that take place at the early part of sort of the innovation curve, and start thinking more strategically about sequencing, which is exactly why the team has been working on these these strategic, or this strategic vision, which is the roadmap. So sorry, that was half an answer.
Thanks, Ian. So maybe I'll open up the second part of the question around increasing rates of return within green financial instruments to Lewis and to Christian.
Very briefly, enabling markets is the first step, and actually it ties in very much with Ian's response. So for example, in the South Korean emissions trading scheme, unless you're in the emissions trading scheme, you're not allowed to trade emissions, and you're not allowed to trade futures. And the same applies in China. You can't trade futures in China. So of course, if you want investment in the sectors covered by the emissions trading scheme to get them to reduce their emissions, you need firstly the enabling legislation to allow these things to happen, or indeed no disabling legislation that bans the use of forward and futures trading. And the second is stability. So the first round of the ETS in Kazakhstan was 1 year, the second round was 2 years, and then we've had a break, and then the next round will be presumably 3 years. Europe went through something similar. The first period was 3 years long, the second period was 5, and then the next 8. So to get stability, to get investment returns, to get investment returns, we need stability and an enabling trading environment. So I would encourage learning the lessons from the previous 2 phases of the Kazakh ETS and trying to look a little bit longer term than 3 years in the next phase, if that's at all possible. So that would be my recommendation.
Very briefly, Christian.
Yeah, I think there's an overemphasis on the green side on the technology and the technology performance right now. It's in fact, the question is much more of mitigating certain parts of risk. There's a lot of financial innovation that could go, so the question is not whether the environmental or green technology performs or whether it performs 1% better or not. I think the question is much more looking at what is the financial tool. It's the question of finding the right financial model for that type of asset, which is not the same asset as a massive big coal plant. You need a financial solution that's different, and within that solution you need to find what are the smaller risk categories that you could mitigate with existing insurance products or first loss guarantees, whatever, to start driving down the risk, and that way also increasing the returns. I think it's more of financial innovation and matching the right financial risk mitigation tool than necessarily trying to find a solution that produces more megawatt hours or of course that's important in the long run, but for specific projects.
Ian, you'd like to jump back in?
Yeah, I'm just on this rate of return point of view. Quite often we think about the sort of the supply side, but one case study I think is really interesting to highlight is something that's going on at the moment in China by a company called Ant Financial. So it's the financial services part of Alipay. And effectively what they're doing is they've set up an app which their 450 million members can sign up to. And effectively what it does is it measures effectively the carbon or environmental footprint of your transaction. So for example, if you take a train from Shanghai to Beijing rather than flying, it will give you what they call good energy. And if you get a certain amount of good energy, they give you a virtual tree. And if you accumulate enough virtual trees, they give you a real tree. Now what's fascinating about this, in a year, 200 million people have signed up to use it. So that's 3% of the world's population. And what it's doing, there's no financial gain. You don't accumulate points that you can cash in. It's for purely altruistic reasons. And what's really interesting is it's a combination of sort of digital technologies and online transactions, and it's changing consumption patterns. So it's basically a demand-side intervention, which obviously hopefully would flow through on what corporates offer and then upstream to the financing. So it's just to say that there is a sort of solution space on the demand side, and not just on the supply side, that can influence rates of return that we don't know much about, but potentially is really exciting if this Chinese case study can be replicated and understood in more detail.
We have a question here. Microphone, please. One at the front and then one in the middle.
Okay. On the question of returns, I think it's an important one because eventually the market will respond to the ability to make a return. I think there's one example on the bonds in the Netherlands which I think could be of interest as well, which is that there's a fiscal differentiation between the tax, dividend tax on green versus non-green. And that differentiation draws in a lot of capital to the green bit.
We have another question here.
О том, что новые технологии, они как бы влияют на инвестиционные показатели. А вот как влияет финансовая сфера в рамках новых технологий, вот блокчейн, да, на привлечение инвестиций именно вот в данной предметной области? То есть, по сути дела, это альтернативное, да, финансирование. Но можно ли в рамках МФЦ использовать эти технологии блокчейна для привлечения тех же самых инвесторов, но уже более другими методами, способами?
Thank you. A very topical and timely question. We have thought about this. I'm going to turn to Ian to answer on the role of technology. Yeah.
Yep, so again, very good question. I think where we stand now is that we all, I think, accept that technology is going to be a major disruptor, but we don't quite understand how it's going to play out. And we know there are going to be some positives. It's going to reduce friction, that's quite clear. There's also going to be some unintended consequences. So I personally think it's going to turn the insurance market on its head. When we lower the level of risk analysis from the portfolio level, which is the current level, down to the level of the individual. And I think that's just, I don't know what the implications are, but it's going to mean huge chunks of people are uninsurable. It's going to mean premiums drop. It's going to mean the people that qualify for insurance probably don't want insurance. And it could mean a huge liability for the state. So I think the point is there's lots of upsides and lots of downsides. And what we've got to do now is just try and explore this space and try and understand how to harness the good stuff and limit the bad stuff. And to that effect, we launched in January this year something called the Green Digital Finance Alliance. that's trying to bring together experts from the sort of sustainability space and experts from the fintech or the digital space more broadly, and understand this, this intersection. So blockchain is a classic example. Everyone knows that it's potentially game-changing. No one really knows that much about it, if we're being honest. But there are definitely some practical applications where you can see how it might unlock finance. So one example is Indonesia. I used to do a bit of work there, and small-scale farmers find it very hard to access finance because they can't prove they own the land on which they farm. So blockchain, in theory, if the data is input correctly, could allow you to verify there's only one owner of the land, and therefore unlock financing that could be delivered by these virtual channels. So I think there's a continuum of technologies. We understand the sort of the mobile end. It's quite intuitive, things like M-Pesa in Kenya, but there's a whole bunch of technologies at the other end that I think we conceptually know are going to be disruptive, could have good and could have bad consequences, and that's the area we really need to understand. But it's very encouraging that the AIFC is focusing on this area and is very aware of you know, the potential disruption, positive and negative, of technology.
Thank you, Ian. And I would like to say that, that there is obviously an opportunity for AIFC to innovate, to experiment, to test the market, given the AIFC's unique status and its role in developing new opportunities within the financial sector, which brings me on to, I think, the last segment of our presentation before we conclude. I'm going to move through this quickly, which is, we've heard from Christian some of the detailed recommendations and steps we are proposing the AIFC take up, but I want to take a step back and look at more broadly the role of AIFC in the financial system and in developing a green financial sector. In the meantime, I'm going to give permission to Lewis and Ian to depart. We're going to let them off for good behavior, so thank you very much for your presentations and contributions. Oh, okay. So it's just Lewis. Even better. So in order to understand the AIFC's role within the system, we need to understand two things. We need to understand what the shape is of AIFC, what does it look like, what are its features, what are its special attributes, and we need to understand the institutional setting in which it finds itself. I'm not going to talk about this too much, but I just want to concentrate on AIFC's unique features, which are, it is established under constitutional law. The President signed the decree. It is governed by constitutional law. No small achievement, by the way. Its management council includes all of the highest level economic and financial policy makers in the country. President, Prime Minister, the Governor of the Central Bank, and the Ministers of Economy and Finance. So it has a real mandate, and it has the strongest possible levers of governance. And obviously, its special regulatory regime, it lies outside of the domestic financial sector. It lies outside of domestic financial rules and regulations. We've heard a lot about this from Governor Kelembetov over the last couple of days. And importantly, it is adopting international rules and regulations based on the principles of English law, separate court system, using expatriate judges. This is the model we've seen in Dubai that works well. So it has a unique status. The institutional setting in which it finds itself. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but just to underline the pillars. Capacity building. This is education and training, professional certification. We see a key role for AIFC there in its Bureau for Professional Education, professional and continuing education. Policy and regulation, finance and monitoring and reporting. And I'm going to come on to those specifically in a moment. So here are those pillars and where the AIFC fits in specifically. courts within policy and regulation, the AFC authority too as a driver of policy. Finance, obviously, AFC exchange. This is attracting and mobilizing private sources of finance, and monitoring and reporting. And that's both the exchange and the Financial Services Authority. So we see three key centers of gravity for the AFC's role. First, in coordination. Here, what we're talking about is linking up, as Ian mentioned, connecting the dots, linking up the multiple institutional players and actors and market actors. The green economy cuts across many, many boundaries. It's not just the financial sector. It's the power sector, it's the water sector, it's the transportation sector. So there is a need for a national champion that can improve communication, improve coordination, that can sit above the wall, as it were, and pull the various strings together, and at the same time, drive the green finance agenda in the country. So communicate the messages, remind the different market actors and players of what the overall ambitions are and where Kazakhstan is in the current process. The second center of gravity is in capacity building. And here we're recommending that the AFC be the center of excellence for green finance within the country. And what does that mean? There's a couple of components there. One is capacity building in terms of human capital. And this is AIFC Bureau, the Bureau for Continuing Professional Development. The AIFC has a mandate to develop the next and future cadre of finance professionals. And so there's an opportunity here for the AIFC to embed environmental considerations and green finance principles within the financial education system. The second component is really about knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing. So it's about the AIFC joining international knowledge sharing networks, and it's about building capacity among policymakers, sharing that information to those decision makers within the line ministries that have to implement at multiple levels, not just the high levels, at the mid levels as well. This is about an education process across government. And then finally, it's about developing a professional certification program, so that these are not just talks. That green finance is really embedded into the culture of the financial sector. And then finally, the third center of gravity is around market development. And we're not prioritizing these in terms of importance. They're all important, but market development obviously has the most visible impact. And so what we're talking about here is the Astana Exchange becoming a hub for green finance in the country. And that involves initially, in the first steps, bringing the emissions trading system onto the AIX. We heard Lewis's recommendations about how to effectively achieve that and some of the pitfalls and barriers to avoid. It's also about developing a green bond market, providing the exchange as a destination for issuers, and being the location of best practice for regulation, for disclosure, and for transparency. Having a destination for project pipelines where investors can go to see the investment opportunities within the green economy. So each of these centers of gravity are designed to address specific barriers that we've identified and already talked about. I'm not going to go into those in detail, but to concentrate on the recommendations, We are recommending a national roadmap signed by the President. We believe the AIFC should take the lead in developing that. They should also join the Council on Green Economy Transition under the President, representing the financial sector, and lead a new committee on green finance. For the Center of Excellence, we've talked about this. The professional certification program is important, but also peer learning and knowledge sharing networks to disseminate best practices. So having a destination for the most up-to-date information and best practice. And also to consider initiatives like providing a secondee program to foster cross-border collaboration, which possibly they could work with EBRD or OECD on these types of programs. And then finally, as a green finance hub, is to initiate the development of a green bond market. This is a first step, becoming the benchmark for green finance disclosure and reporting frameworks, and taking the lead on developing local green standards. Here, I just want to emphasize, though, that we're not recommending initially that AIFC should develop green standards from scratch. In order to effectively stimulate the market and really to get going, what we're recommending is a use of an international template, a very simple set of reporting frameworks and green standards, and a longer period of local tailored standard setting. This is how China moved so quickly in their green bond market. They had a one-page set of green bond standards and principles drawn from international experience, and they're only now developing local, tailored, substantive, and detailed principles. That was enough to shift the entire global green bond market, by the way. And so we're recommending that the same approach in Kazakhstan. Start quickly, based on a limited template of international best practice, and then over time develop a more substantive, detailed, tailored set of local standards. That will allow the market to get going. And so I'm now going to ask my colleague Jürgen to close out the session with putting our recommendations onto a timeline. Jürgen.
Okay, with this chart, we just want to summarize the roadmap for how we see the Kazakh green financial system develop under the leadership of AIFC. And as you see from left to the right, it has a timing dimension. We envision that there are three major phases. We're already in 2017, and we think that in this year and the next year, we consider that the initiation phase, so there will be a lot of groundwork but also we think that especially in the green bonds area and in the ETS area, AIFC can really put its mark on the map and become already an actor in the green financial system. So not just developing standards and doing enabling activities, but actually becoming a major player in those two areas already. So then in the next phase, in the deepening phase, so this may be for another 3 years. So we think that there's, and then we have the expansion phase from 22 to 25. So there's this other dimension that we have in the vertical dimension. So we think there are at least 5 areas where we expect action. One, the very important role that Katulis has identified as for AIFC as a national champion. So that's certainly in the area of leadership and capacity building and bringing all the key ministries and players in the field together to mobilize for the creation of the financial system. Then in the area of regulation, which my colleague Vadim talked about, this is probably not an area that we recommend where to start with the activities, but to really think this through on what needs to be changed during the deepening phase, and then start implementing those regulatory changes in the expansion phase. So for the ETS, so we think there are also several different steps. First, to become a player as an exchange. And then in the following phases, introducing new financial instruments such as derivatives to allow future trading for carbon allowances, and then further on to also link the Kazakh carbon market with other regional ETS systems, especially in Europe, but also in Korea, in the United States. So also to provide additional liquidity to the market and integrate this ETS into a global carbon market. We talked about, my colleague Christian talked a lot about the green bonds, so that we also see that there's a progression there. So first to have a reference bond to launch, to give orientation, to establish pricing in the first phase, but then go towards developing local standards in the green bonds area, and eventually also go to developing indices for green bonds. One thing that we haven't talked about so much is the regional focus, how that is expanding over time for AIFC, first starting on the AIFC territory, then applying those experiences for the wider national Kazakh economy, and then eventually becoming a regional hub for green finance for all of Central Asia.
Thank you, Jürgen, and thanks to all of you for participating and joining us for today's session. I'd like to give the final word to our friends at the AIFC, to Aidar Kazibayev, to close us out today. Aidar.
Thank you very much, everyone. And first of all, today we showed all presentation of our speakers, and I think that all of you and all opinion of our speakers, we will collaborate on one of the big report, and I would like to invite you to the final workshop in September in that export territory, where we would like to show all the results of our joint project with EBRD. So thank you very much for first of Katulus, and for today you will a strong moderator. Thank you.